We've been told that the world we live in is unprecedented, that loneliness is because of smartphones, that the feeling of meaninglessness is because of modern society, that addiction is a product of dopamine engineering. Maybe you have felt the creeping sense that you are working hard at a life that doesn't quite feel like yours. The dull ache of wanting something more, but you're not sure what. The low tremor of fear at every little change. Burnout, identity confusion, fear of change, toxic masculinity. You've been told these are all new problems that plague us. And some of that is true, but not much. The framing of these ailments is new, but the wounds themselves are ancient. History, as they say, always repeats itself. The people who wrestled with these wounds long before you were born did not leave you empty-handed. They left entire systems, detailed practices, and stubborn little stories that survived for millennia for one reason only: because they worked. I am going to share with you 14 of those lesser-known stories. 14 people from different centuries and continents who all arrived at remarkably similar answers. By the end, you will receive the wisdom someone, somewhere in your life, should have given you 30 years ago. And when you wake up tomorrow, the modern world will never look the same again. Welcome, Nightlings. This is Huxley. If you like listening or falling asleep to real stories that will reveal life's deeper truths, then this is the place for you. Now, to something I've kept quiet on but need to share with you. The last few months have not been easy. YouTube and Spotify, for reasons of their own, have been changing, penalizing channels. Especially long 3+ hour videos have been getting less reach unless the video is heavily edited. You may have seen it happening on other channels too. Creators are watching their reach shrink, or even being demonetized. You can see it on the screen just here. That line, sloping downward across the months, is what has happened to this channel since the changes began. But if you look at this shorter Tolstoy video, it did really well, which tells me plainly where the road is going. It has been harder than I'd like to admit, and I would like, more than anything, to keep making these stories for you. I'm still going to make the same videos for you, but I will put extended versions on Patreon. 4 hours to 8 hours. The topics go a little deeper, and I'll explore some less sanitized content than on YouTube and Spotify. You can vote on which stories come next for Spotify. And I'll also read classics like Poe, Lovecraft, Brothers Grimm, which supporters can choose only on Patreon. Every dollar funds more editing time for my editor to make the videos here better and longer. If that sounds like something you would want to support, the door is open. The Patreon link is below. Muskogee, Oklahoma. The year is 1902. The final years of the wild, wild West. The late autumn air smells of dust and horse, and the last faint smoke of cook fires from the old Indian territory outside town. Inside a small federal marshal's office, behind a wooden desk scarred by decades of boots and pens and the weight of heavier things, sits a black man in his mid-60s. Silver runs through his long moustache like a river through dark rock. He has the kind of face that does not give up its thoughts. His back is straight. His hands rest on the desk. He is waiting for something. A young clerk approaches, holds out a paper, slides it across the wood, The older man lifts it without hurry, because in his life, hurry has killed a great many men, and never once helped a single one of them. He reads, "The name on the warrant is Benny Reeves. He knows that name. He has said that name in the dark, when the children were small, and the house was still, and the lamp was low." Benny Reeves is his own son. The charge, written in a plain government hand beneath the name, is murder. The victim is Benny's own wife. Now sit with that for a moment. Because the man at that desk is not just any lawman. He is Bass Reeves, and by the end of tonight, you will never forget his name. 3,000 arrests in his career. 14 men killed in self-defense, never one in anger. Never once across 32 years was Bass Reeves wounded in all those years in the Wild West. Not a bullet. Not a knife. He was born enslaved in Arkansas in 1838. His body, for the first 23 years of his life, was not his own. And yet, by the age of 64, he had become, by nearly every honest assessment, the most successful lawman in the history of the American West. The historian Art T. Burton argues that he was the real-life basis for the Lone Ranger. Look at the parallels. You cannot easily unsee them. And now, at 64, after all of that, a warrant with his own son's name on it has just slid across his desk. The other marshals in the office, good men who have ridden beside Bass for years, know what this means. One clears his throat. Another steps forward. Offers to take the warrant. Says, softly, that nobody will think less of Bass. Says, this is not the kind of ride any man should have to make against his own blood. Bass Reeves sets the warrant down, flat on the desk, and smooths it once with his broad hand. He does not look up for a long time. When he does, his eyes are steady, and they are gentle, and they are already made up. He speaks 7 words. He will say other things in his life, but these are the ones that will be remembered. I'll bring him in myself. And so, on a grey morning in November 1902, Bass Reeves walks out to his stable. He saddles his horse the way he has saddled a horse 10,000 times before. He tightens the cinch. He checks the rifle. He fills his saddlebag with jerky and coffee. And he rides out of Muskogee into the territory on the last hard ride of his long career, carrying a warrant with his son's name on it, and a weight that no badge in the world was ever designed to bear. He will find him. We both know he will find him. But what happens when he does? What he does when his son stands in front of him, that is the story I want to tell you tonight. Because what Bass Reeves does at the end of that ride is what it means to be a man, in every language, across every century. But before we get there, a small favor. If these stories speak to you, if you find comfort in the lessons found in the quiet corners of history, tap the follow button to join our circle of dreamers, and let the next story find you when you need it most. Now, let's drift back. Crawford County, Arkansas, 1838. The cabin where the Reeves slaves sleep has a dirt floor and a single small window. Outside, a cold rain is falling on the cotton fields. Inside a baby is born. A healthy boy, they say. Nobody writes it down, because he is not a person in the ledger that matters. He is listed as property. His mother names him softly Bas. Not Basil, not Sebastian, just Bas. Short, steady. The family that owns him is headed by William Steele Reeves, a local planter and later a politician. When Bas is a very small boy, the family relocates to Grayson County, Texas. And in Texas, little Bas becomes the personal body servant to William's son, George. George is impulsive, quick-tempered, given to drink. Bas becomes his shadow. He learns very early to anticipate the needs of a man who will beat him if those needs are not anticipated. And here is where the forging begins. Because you can own a boy's body, but you cannot, if the boy has a certain kind of soul, own his inner rule. Bas learns, down in that service, that a man's dignity cannot depend on other men granting it. If it did, he would have no dignity. So he stops asking. He stops waiting for permission to be whole. He decides that the quiet part of him, the part behind the eyes, is the only part that is truly his, and he guards it like a candle in a wind. He learns other things too. He learns to shoot. George takes him on hunts, partly for help, partly for show. Bas has an eye, a steady hand, a calm that does not waver. By his late teens, he is one of the best marksmen in the county, black or white. George likes to bet on him against other men's slaves. Bas usually wins. The money goes to George. And patience. Slavery is a long lesson in patience, because impatience for a slave is lethal. You learn how to wait, how to hold a grievance without spending it. Bas, by the age of 20, has the patience of a 60-year-old monk, which later, when we see him crouched in a thicket for 3 days waiting for a fugitive, will turn out to be important. There is a rule he forms somewhere in these years. A man's dignity cannot depend on other men granting it, and a man's word must be heavier than his wish. The rule will survive the plantation. The rule will survive the war. And one night in 1861, with a deck of cards on the table between him and his master's son, that rule will make Bas strike the first blow of his own life. History, especially the history of enslaved people, is patchy, and the details get polished by time. But the core of it, the part every version agrees on, is this. Bas and George are playing cards. The Civil War is coming. The house is tense. The bottle between them has been open too long. A dispute breaks out over a hand. Whether Bas cheated or George cheated, we will never know. What we know is that George's temper rises, and George reaches for a weapon. George has beaten Bas many times before. Tonight, perhaps, he intends to do something worse. And here, for the first time in his 23 years, Bas strikes first. He hits George in the face, hard enough to fell him. The man who has owned his body is slumped across the table. Bas stands there in the stillness, and he knows. He knows what happens to a slave who has struck his master's son. There is no version of tomorrow that does not end with Bas swinging from a tree. So tomorrow does not get to happen. Tonight is where he leaves. He rides into the dark, heading north, because north of Texas lies Indian Territory, the land of the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Seminole. These nations had been forced from their homelands along the Trail of Tears, and their territory was legally outside the jurisdiction of Texas slave law. For an escaped slave, it was one of the only places the hounds could not follow. He reaches it. The Seminole and the Creek and eventually the Cherokee take him in. And they do more than take him in. They teach him. Over the next several years, Bass learns to speak 6 native languages: Muskogee Creek, Seminole, Cherokee, pieces of Comanche, Chickasaw, Choctaw. He becomes fluent enough to negotiate, to trade, to tell a joke at a fire. He learns native tracking, which makes modern tracking look like a sketch next to an oil painting. He learns to read a bent blade of grass, a broken twig, a hoof print 3 days old in dry soil. And he learns a different model of what a man is. In these communities, manhood is about your word, your courage, your readiness to stand where you are needed. Bass, who already had the rule, meets a whole culture that has built its life around it. He is, for the first time, not an outlier. He is home. When the Civil War ends in 1865, Bass is a free man by law. He walks back to Arkansas, buys a small farm near Van Buren, marries a woman named Nellie Jenny. They have children. He tills the land. For about 10 years, he is outwardly just a black farmer in Reconstruction-era Arkansas. He is waiting, though he does not know it yet. The badge is coming, and when it comes, he will be ready. 1875. A man named Isaac Parker arrives at the federal court in Fort Smith, Arkansas. History will remember him as the hanging judge. His court has jurisdiction over 75,000 square miles of Indian Territory, a country effectively lawless, a sanctuary for outlaws and horse thieves and murderers. Parker needs deputies who can ride into that country, speak its languages, and come back alive. He hires 200 of them. One of them is Bass Reeves. He is 37 years old. He has a wife, children, and a farm. He has never held a badge. But word has traveled back from the Creek and the Seminole. A black man who speaks the territory's languages, who tracks like a native scout, who shoots like a sharpshooter. Parker pins the badge on him and sends him west. What follows is one of the most extraordinary careers in American law enforcement. Over 32 years, Bass will ride into the territory again and again, alone or with a posse, bringing back men other marshals could not find, would not chase, or were afraid to confront. 3,000 arrests, 14 men killed in self-defense, every one of them genuinely self-defense. Never once wounded. His methods were ingenious. He disguised himself as a farmer leaning on a hoe, as a tramp, as a preacher asking for a meal. One famous story has him arriving at the cabin of 2 outlaws, the Brunter brothers, dressed as a saddle tramp in rags. They invited him in, bragged about their crimes, fed him dinner. After dinner, Bass stood up, pulled a warrant from inside his shirt, and read out their names. The brothers reached for their guns. Bass shot them both before they cleared leather. He was that fast. Another story has him arresting a man at the man's own dinner table, The wife invited him in, thinking he was a drifter. Bass ate the stew, complimented the cooking, thanked her, and then informed her husband he was under arrest. The husband went along peacefully. He had seen something in the stranger's eyes between bites of stew that told him any resistance would be his last. And here is the detail I find rather wonderful. Bass could not read or write. His entire career, he carried warrants he could not read. His wife Nellie would read them to him at home, over and over, until he had memorized them perfectly. Then he could recite the full legal text back at the fugitive in perfect legal phrasing, which is impressive, considering most of us cannot even remember where we set down the remote. He was, by every measure, the best marshal in the West. Not the flashiest, the best, trusted by white judges, feared by white outlaws, respected by native communities, and loved by the black families in Muskogee and Van Buren who quietly pressed their children forward to shake his hand. All of this would have been enough for a full life. 3,000 arrests. A legend. But in 1902, 64 years old, a warrant slides across his desk with a name on it that breaks the neat symmetry of his career. A name he has said in the dark, on a porch in Arkansas, when the children were very small. Benny Reeves, his son, his boy. A grown man now, with a wife of his own. In the late summer of 1902, Benny and his wife quarreled. Benny, in a fit of jealous rage, killed her, shot her, in most accounts, a moment of violent impulse that would define the rest of his life, and part of the rest of his father's life, too. The warrant is sworn out. It lands on the desk of the very office Bass has worked out of for years. And for a few days, the question of who will serve that warrant becomes the most painful question in the jurisdiction. Other marshals volunteer. Any of them would take it. Nobody, they say, will think less of you if you step aside. You have given 32 years. You have earned the right to let another man ride out. Bass sits for a long time without speaking. He reads the warrant. He does not weep. He does not rage. He simply shakes his head once. And he says the sentence we already know. I'll bring him in myself. Sit with the weight of that. Because this is not a man who does not love his son. Every account of Bass, from native informants to his own children, describes him as deeply feeling. A devoted father, a tender husband. Bass loves his son. Bass is breaking, somewhere under his shirt, over this warrant. He takes it anyway, because the rule he has carried his whole life, forged in slavery, tempered in the territory, is now being asked for by his own life. A man's word must be heavier than his wish. He wished with every ounce of his father's heart that someone else would take the ride. But he was the man who took the rides. That was his word. His badge was not a costume. His principle was not a slogan. So he rides. He finds Benny. The records suggest it was not a long pursuit. Benny may have been waiting, in a way. The arrest is peaceful. No shooting. No resistance. A father and son in a clearing looking at each other across a gulf that neither of them had expected to cross. Bass handcuffs his son. Bass reads him the warrant, because by now, at 64, He knows the text of every warrant he has ever served, better than some lawyers know their own names. Bass rides Benny back to Muskogee. Benny is tried. Benny is convicted. Benny is sentenced to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. And here is the part of the story that almost nobody tells. The part that breaks my heart more than the arrest itself. Bass Reeves visits him. Goes to Leavenworth when he can, in the remaining years of his own life. Keeps writing to him through scribes. Never abandons the boy. Benny, by the accounts we have, is a model prisoner. Gets out eventually on good behavior. Returns to Oklahoma. Stays more or less close to the family for the rest of his days. Bass remains his father and the law simultaneously until the very last breath of his life. Bass Reeves retires in 1907. He takes one final job as a Muskogee police officer for his last couple of years, walking a city beat with a cane. He dies in 1910 at the age of 72 of Bright's disease. Black families in town mourn him. White families in town mourn him. Native families in town mourn him. The newspaper obituaries, even the ones that slip in a casual 1910 racism in other paragraphs, describe him with something close to reverence. And here is what I want to say to you, by a dwindling fire at this hour of the night. We talk a lot in our era about what is called toxic masculinity, about men who confuse cruelty with strength, men who perform dominance, men who break the people they are supposed to protect, and call it leadership. And the conversation is necessary. The critique is fair. But what the critique often lacks, what it has not always had a word for, is the thing masculinity looks like when it is healthy, when it is the real article, when it is neither soft nor cruel, when it is a quiet spine that will hold the line against itself, because here is the truth. The hardest thing a man will ever do is enforce the principle he claims to believe in, when the principle costs him somebody he loves. That is what Bass Reeves did. He did not arrest his son because he loved his son less. He arrested his son because he loved his son more than he loved his own comfort, and more than he loved his own reputation, and more than he loved his own peace. He loved his son enough to be the father who would not let him skip the consequence, because letting him skip the consequence would have been a different kind of abandonment. And if you are listening tonight, I want you to think about this. Somewhere in your life, there is a conversation you have been avoiding because it will hurt someone you love. A boundary you have been refusing to enforce because enforcement looks like cruelty. A truth you have been holding in your throat because releasing it will change the room. Bass Reeves is not asking you to arrest anyone tonight. He is asking you, I think, to do something much smaller and, in its way, much braver. Before you go to sleep tonight, think of one conversation you have been avoiding. Not one to have tomorrow, just one to have this week. Write the first sentence of it on a piece of paper. Put it somewhere you will see it when you wake up. That is all tonight, just the first sentence. And do this every Sunday. One avoided conversation. One first sentence. Watch what changes in a year. I will tell you now, without knowing you, that what will change is not only the conversations. What will change is the posture of the small, quiet part of you that has been tired of carrying unsaid things. That part will begin, week by week, to straighten. Now, Bass Reeves taught us that the hardest thing a man can do is hold the line when the line costs him everything. But the next ancient thinker, he taught us something almost opposite. That sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is let the line dissolve entirely, and start over, completely, and then start over again, and again, and again, 30 times. Edo, Japan, 1760. The city we now call Tokyo, then a sprawling capital of nearly 1 million people. A riot of wooden houses and tiled roofs and canals full of barges, and the constant smell of smoke and fish and cherry blossom. In a modest home somewhere in the artisan district, a boy is born to a mirror polisher. The family, we think, is connected to the Nakajima clan, metalworkers to the shogun, though the exact parentage is murky. What we know is that the boy's given name is Tokitaro. That is what his mother calls him. That is what is written in whatever family record there was. He will not keep the name long. The boy grows up in the clatter and shine of his father's workshop. Edo period mirrors were made of polished bronze, which meant they were pieces of labor, craft, patience, and delicate judgment. A good mirror polisher could make a piece of dull metal shine like water. The boy watches his father do this, day after day, hour after hour, the rhythmic motion of the cloth, the slow emergence of reflection from dullness. It is his first lesson, though he does not know it yet, in what a lifetime of practice can do to an object. He begins to draw, very early. By 6, they say, he is already sketching everything. By 12, his father has apprenticed him to a wood engraver. The engraver, a man named Shugoro, teaches him the basics of carving blocks for woodblock prints. It is good preparation. It gives him the patience for line and grain. By the time he is 18, he is ready for the next teacher. That teacher is Katsukawa Shunsho, one of the greatest masters of ukiyo-e, the floating world genre, which specialized in portraits of kabuki actors, beautiful women, and scenes from the pleasure districts of Edo. Shunsho's workshop is prestigious. Admission is competitive. And young Tokitaro is accepted. He is given a new name. This is traditional. When you entered a school, you received a studio name. His is Shunro, which includes the Shun character from his master. He signs his first prints Shunro. He is, in every visible way, a good apprentice, conventional, disciplined, loyal to the house style of Katsukawa, which is elegant, stylized, polished. But something is wrong, or rather, something is true, and he is beginning to notice it. The Katsukawa school forbids studying with other schools. It is a closed system, a lifelong loyalty oath, more or less. And Shunro, curious, restless, hungry, begins to study other schools on the side. He looks at the Kano school, which is more naturalistic. He looks at the Tosa school, which is rooted in the classical court tradition. He looks at imported Chinese painting. He looks at early Dutch engravings that have made their way to Japan through the little trading port of Nagasaki, the only place Westerners were allowed. He is caught. Around 1794, he is expelled from the Katsukawa school for studying rival traditions. this could have been the end of him. In Edo period Japan, being expelled from a major workshop was a near-death sentence for a young artist. Patrons dried up. Other schools were suspicious of a student who had burned one bridge, and Shunro, nearly 35 years old, finds himself on the street, penniless with a wife to feed and no name that opens a door. So he does something most artists of his era would not have done. He takes another name, not an official studio name, not one awarded by a master, a name he chooses himself. He calls himself Hokusai, which translates roughly to North Studio, and carries a resonance of the pole star, Buddhism, a certain religious devotion to a particular star, and a particular discipline. It is, in a sense, a declaration of independence. He is nobody's student anymore. He is his own school now, and he will figure out what that means as he goes. What he does not yet know is that this is only the first of more than 30 names he will use in his life. The river has started moving, and he is letting it. Across the next 6 decades, Hokusai will change his name roughly 30 times. Shunro, Sori, Hokusai, Taito, Itsu, Manji, Gakyo Rojin, the old man mad about art. Dozens more in between, documented in signatures on paintings, in diary entries, in publishers' records. Each name shift corresponds roughly to a new artistic direction, a new style, a new stage of mastery. When he felt he had learned what a particular identity could teach him, he shed it. He also moved house 93 times, 93. Once a year for most of his adult life, which is impressive, considering Edo did not have moving companies or hardware stores with bubble wrap. Some of the moves were practical. Debt, a fire, a flood, an unwelcome landlord. But many of them seem to have been, if we are honest, just restlessness, a refusal to let a room shape him, a refusal to let the habit of a doorway and a window become the frame of his life. And here is the thing you have to understand about Edo period Japan. This behavior was radical. It was not a minor quirk. In a Confucian society that prized lifelong loyalty to one teacher, one house, one place, one social role, Hokusai was essentially shouting, with every move and every new signature, that identity was a garment, not a skeleton, not a soul. A garment, something you wear when it fits and replace when it does not. You can sew your name into the lining. But when the garment grows too tight, or too worn, or too small for the shape you are growing into, you do not cling to it out of loyalty. You fold it up, thank it, and you sew yourself something new. He sold the old names to other artists sometimes. They would buy them happily, because a name Hokusai had used carried a certain reputation. It was, in a sense, one of the world's earliest personal brand transactions. But he did not mourn the names. He did not, as far as we can tell from the record, even much miss them. Each one had been a role he wore while he was that particular version of himself. Each one had taught him what it could. And then he let it go. If you think this sounds romantic, let me correct you. He was often poor. His second wife died. Of his children, 2 sons died before him. A daughter, Wei, became his constant companion. and a painter in her own right, likely ghost painting large portions of his later works. He lived for much of his life in one small room, with a brazier and a mat and a pile of brushes, drawing on cheap paper because he could not always afford the good stuff. The reinventions were not a luxury, they were a discipline, the only discipline that kept him growing. He is, in his 50s, a successful illustrator. He produces manga, popular sketchbooks, a huge thing in Edo publishing. He teaches students. He is famous in a modest way. Most men in his position at that point would have settled, established a studio, trained a son, rested on the commissions. Hokusai does not. At 54, he signs some of his manga with one name. At 65, he is signing landscapes with another name. At 61, he announces, in a preface to a book, that everything he has done up to now has been practice, that his real work is still ahead of him. 61 years old, and he is, in his own assessment, still warming up. Now, let me say something about this, because it might be the most important thing in the whole story. The modern listener often assumes that the fear of change is a fear of the new. But it is not really. The fear of change is a fear of loss. A fear of the self you built over decades being dissolved. A fear that the version of you who learned, who suffered, who accumulated will be thrown away. Hokusai did not have that fear. Or he did, I suppose, but he overruled it again and again, because he noticed something most of us miss. The self that gets dissolved is not destroyed, it is digested. Every version feeds the next. The apprentice Shunro became the outcast Hokusai, who became the mature master Taito, who became the old sage Gakyo Rojin. None of them were wasted. Each of them was the compost for the one that came after. And so, at the age of 71, an age when most masters have long since died or retired, when most artists of his tradition have signed their last prints and faded into grandfatherhood, Hokusai begins a new series. The series that will make him the most recognized artist in Japanese history. And it turns out, in the whole world. 1831. The publisher Nishimura Aijudo commissions a series of landscapes from Hokusai, now 71 years old. The theme is Mount Fuji, the sacred mountain, seen from 36 different angles. The series will be called Fugaku Sanju Rokkei, the 36 views of Mount Fuji. It will eventually, due to popular demand, be expanded to 46 views, but we still call it the 36. Hokusai has been drawing waves for decades. Rough sketches from his 30s and 40s survive, showing a man trying and trying and trying to find the right way to render a wave. He has not, up to this point, found it. The waves in his earlier work are competent, pretty, but they are static. They do not move. They are wallpaper with foam. Something about being 71 and 14 names deep, and knowing he is starting again, unlocks what he could not unlock before. He begins to paint a wave in a way nobody has ever painted one. A massive wave, curling like a claw in the foreground. 3 boats, tiny, almost toy-like, caught in the trough. Mount Fuji far behind, small and serene, contrasting with the wild foreground. The composition is audacious. The wave is nearly grabbing the viewer. Fuji, supposedly the subject, is almost an afterthought. A quiet pyramid under the wave's hand, he uses a new pigment. Prussian blue. A synthetic pigment invented in Germany and only recently available in Japan through trade. It is a blue so deep and so steady that it makes every previous Japanese blue look grey by comparison. He uses it with a kind of hunger. The wave is Prussian blue. The trough is Prussian blue. The sky is Prussian blue. He has, without quite knowing it, helped invent a new visual vocabulary for the world. He calls the print Kanagawa Okai Nami Ura, under the wave of Kanagawa. In the West we will, eventually, simply call it the Great Wave. And it will become, over the next century and a half, probably the most famous single work of art produced in East Asia. More than 1 million copies of the original print across the series run will survive to our day. Reproductions will appear on everything from coffee cups to album covers to laptop cases. The wave will become shorthand in the global mind for a particular kind of beautiful, uncontrollable force. Modern mathematicians have looked at the curve of Hokusai's wave and discovered, with some amazement, that it closely matches the fractal structure of real ocean waves under storm conditions. The curl, the foam, the way the crest breaks into smaller waves that themselves break into smaller waves, all of it. He was not a mathematician. He had no access to fluid dynamics. He had instead 71 years of watching the world, 71 years of studying how things moved, 71 years of shedding identity after identity in order to keep his eye fresh. And when he finally painted a wave, it was, accidentally and inevitably, accurate at the level of physics. The prints, by the way, sold for roughly the cost of a bowl of noodles. They were the ukiyo-e equivalent of paperbacks. Not fine art, not sanctified, common, disposable. Anyone with a few coins could take one home, which is part of what makes their survival so remarkable. They were loved and pinned to walls and carried around and gifted and, by accident of affection, preserved. At 71, he has made the greatest work of his life. Most men would stop. Hokusai does not stop. 17 more years of new work. 17, from 71 to 88. He will produce over 30,000 works in his lifetime, across every imaginable genre. Landscape, portrait, manga, erotica, religious paintings, supernatural scenes, mathematical treatises with illustrations, flower studies, bird studies, fish studies, a whole illustrated treatise on how to draw using basic geometric shapes, which would later be recognized as a foundational teaching document in modern art education, centuries ahead of Bauhaus. At 75, he writes the sentence that will be quoted in every art history classroom on Earth. I want to read it to you slowly, because it repays slow reading. He says, and I am paraphrasing the most common translation, "From the age of 6, I had a passion for copying the form of things. By the age of 50, I had published an infinity of designs. But all I have produced before the age of 70 is not worth taking into account. At 73, I learned a little about the real structure of nature, of animals, plants, trees, birds, fishes, and insects. Consequently, when I am 80, I shall have made still more progress. At 90, I shall penetrate the mystery of things. At 100, I shall certainly have reached a marvelous stage. and when I am 110, everything I do, be it but a dot or a line, will be alive. Read that one more time, if you can. Not worth taking into account before 70. At 73, learning a little. At 110, everything alive. This is a man who treated his own development as a project with no ceiling, who did not, at any age, suspect he was done. He worked until the last week of his life. In 1849, at 88, he is in his little room with his daughter Oe, still painting. Oe is his eyes and hands when his own begin to fail. They work on new pieces together, her brush refining what his has begun. He is dying of something unspecified, probably a combination of age and the long strain of the work. On the morning of May 10th, 1849, he speaks for the last time. Several witnesses are present. His final words, slightly different in different sources, amount to this: "If only heaven will give me just another 10 years, just another 5 more years, then I could become a real painter." He dies, 88 years old, 30,000 works, 30 names, 93 houses, and on his last breath, still not a real painter. Still, in his own mind, on the way. I love this man. I love him, I have to tell you, more than almost any other figure in the history of Japanese art. Because he did something that very few human beings do. He refused his entire life to think of himself as finished. And the reason he could refuse, the secret machinery that made the refusal sustainable, was precisely his willingness to keep changing his name, to keep shedding the garment, to keep letting the old self dissolve so the new self had room to emerge. You are probably older than Tokitaro was when he arrived at Shunsho's studio. You are probably younger than Hokusai was when he painted The Great Wave. You are, statistically speaking, somewhere in the middle of the life he lived across all those names. And I want to ask you something quietly, while the fire dies down. What name are you wearing right now? Not your legal name. The identity you are holding on to. Failed musician, tired parent, stuck accountant, empty nester, former athlete, recovered something, unrecovered something. Whatever it is, write it down tomorrow. And then, on the same piece of paper, write a new name, not a title, a verb. Beginner, returning, starting, apprenticing, rebuilding. Whatever fits the version of you that wants to be fed next. Carry the paper in your wallet for a week. Hokusai changed his name 30 times. You do not have to change yours 30. You just have to change it once and see what happens. Hokusai changed his name 30 times to stay alive as an artist. But what do you do when history itself decides to erase your name entirely? What do you do when the world takes away every possible identity you could cling to and leaves you with nothing but your own breath? Vienna, 1941. A city that is already, by almost any honest measure, lost. The Nazis marched in 3 years ago, to a crowd that had rehearsed its cheers. The Leopoldstadt Synagogue, the largest in the city, was burned to the ground on the night of November 9th, 1938. along with nearly every other synagogue in Austria and Germany, on what the newspapers would later call Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. The streets of Vienna, a city where Freud had just the year before been forced into exile, are now patrolled by soldiers who pretend not to see certain things and who enforce others with brisk, bureaucratic cruelty. Into this city, a 36-year-old psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl walks home from the hospital. He is a rising figure in Vienna's medical community. He runs a suicide prevention program at a women's hospital. He has published papers on depression, on the existential dimensions of psychological suffering, on what he is already calling privately logotherapy, a therapy of meaning. He has a fiancée, Tilly Grosser. They were married earlier this year, in one of the last Jewish weddings permitted in the city, and he has in his coat pocket a visa. It is an American visa, a miracle of a visa, really, given how scarce they have become and how many thousands of Jewish professionals are desperately trying to get one. He secured it through professional contacts in the United States. It is his way out. New York is waiting. A career abroad is waiting. Life is waiting. The life he had planned, the life he had earned, the life that is, by any reasonable measure, the only rational choice available to him. He is going to visit his parents tonight before he leaves. His father, Gabriel, 81 years old. His mother, Elsa, in her 60s. They are not coming with him. They cannot. They are too old, too rooted, too Jewish in a city that has begun to eat its Jews. Frankl has come to say goodbye. He arrives at the small apartment. His parents are quiet, proud of him, afraid for him, making tea. They have a small piece of white marble on the mantelpiece that he has not seen before. His father, seeing him look at it, says simply, "That is from the synagogue, Leopoldstadt." Frankl picks it up, turns it in his hand. A fragment of the stone the synagogue had been built of, salvaged from the rubble of Kristallnacht. And on the marble, his father points out, a single Hebrew letter is carved. His father tells him which commandment the letter comes from. The 5th commandment. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land. Frankl stands there in the small apartment with the marble in his hand, his visa in his coat pocket, his parents in front of him, and he understands in a single moment that will shape the rest of his life that he cannot go, not that he should not go, not that he is being asked not to go, that he, Viktor Frankl, cannot go. He cannot leave them. The life that is waiting for him in America is a life he could live, but not a life he could live as himself. The meaning of his life is in this room, not in that one. He does not tear the visa up. He simply, over the next weeks, lets it expire. Within 18 months, he and Tilly will be in the Theresienstadt concentration camp. Within 3 years, he will be in Auschwitz. His parents, his brother, his wife will all be dead. And what he chose to stay for, when he chose to stay for it, is the first of the 3 sources of meaning he will later formalize and teach and carry with him to the end of his life. Meaningful love. The life you owe to another person. The meaning that can only be built by staying. He looked at the marble and he stayed. October 1942. The Frankls, along with Victor's parents, are deported to Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt is a propaganda camp, a model ghetto the Nazis will later show off to the Red Cross, pretending it is a humane arrangement. It is not humane. Thousands die of starvation and disease. Gabriel, Frankel's father, will die there. Frankel himself will work as a physician inside the camp, setting up a suicide prevention unit, lecturing to other prisoners on psychological survival. Even here, he is treating patients. Even here, he is doing his work. He has with him, sewn into the lining of his overcoat by Tilly, a manuscript. Years of notes. The beginning of what he has started to call The Doctor and the Soul, the first full articulation of logotherapy. It is not just a book. It is, as he sees it, his reason for being, his contribution, the intellectual legacy he has been building since his 20s. He is a young doctor with a theory he believes will help people. And the manuscript in his coat is the physical form of that theory. He guards it. He keeps the coat on him at all times. He writes in tiny editions when he can find paper. October 1944. He and Tilly are transferred to Auschwitz. 3 days. He will only be in Auschwitz for 3 days. But those 3 days are the hinge of everything. On arrival, the prisoners are ordered to strip. Their clothes are taken. Frankel watches his overcoat, the coat with the manuscript sewn into the lining, go into a pile. He is handed, in exchange, the threadbare rags of a prisoner who has already been sent to the gas chambers. A coat within its pocket, the torn-out single prayer page from a Hebrew prayer book, the Shema, the central declaration of Jewish faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. He reads it as a message, a substitution, not just a scrap of cloth for a scrap of cloth, but a scrap of meaning for a scrap of meaning. The manuscript, his life's work, has been taken. The Shema has been given. Tilly, he will never see again. She is sent on to Bergen-Belsen. She will die there. He will only learn this after the war. He spends his 3 days at Auschwitz on a work detail, barely conscious of the specific tasks, watching everything, taking notes in his mind for a book he does not yet know he will write. From Auschwitz, he is transferred to Kaufering 3, a subcamp of Dachau, a slave labor camp. He will spend the rest of his camp time there, digging, building, starving, watching men die around him. And in these months, the darkest of his life, he begins to notice something. Not about the other prisoners, about himself. He notices that he is still, somehow, himself. The thing that cannot be taken has not been taken. The manuscript is gone. His wife is gone. His parents are gone. His freedom is gone. His name is gone. His clothes are gone. His hair is gone. His dignity, by every external metric, is gone. And still, inside his skull, there is a quiet voice that belongs to him and only him. The voice that decides how he will meet each next hour. The voice that decides what attitude he will take. The voice that decides what these circumstances will mean in his interior life, regardless of what they mean in the economy of the Reich. He is in the middle of hell, discovering the thing he will spend the rest of his life teaching. Meaning is not, it turns out, something that requires external conditions. Meaning can be built on the narrowest surface. Meaning can be constructed in a cell, in a camp, in a dying body, even when every other source of meaning has been burned away. He begins to watch, as a physician, with a physician's eye. Which prisoners survive longer than their bodies should? Which ones die faster than their bodies should? And why? He watches, obsessively, the way a researcher watches. Not because he has a project, but because the noticing is one of the few private acts available to him. And he sees patterns. The prisoners who survive longest are the ones who have something to survive for. A wife waiting outside, a child, a book they have not finished writing, a cause, a purpose, a promise to keep. They have a thread, thin as it may be, that runs from the present moment out of the camp and into a future where they are needed. That thread holds them. The prisoners who die fastest are the ones who have given up on the future, who have decided, often after some specific piece of terrible news, that there is nothing on the other side. Frankl watches one man receive news that his family has been killed. Within days, the man stops eating. Within a week, he is dead. His body is not more broken than anyone else's. His meaning has collapsed. And when the meaning collapses, the body follows faster than any physician would predict. He begins in his head to organize what he is seeing. There are, as far as he can tell, 3 sources of meaning available to a human being, even in conditions like these. The first is meaningful work, something to create, something to build, something to contribute. A book, a craft, a field of expertise, a task that your unique talents can perform. In the camps, this is nearly impossible in its normal form, but even here, Frankl watches prisoners who hold themselves together by giving lectures in secret to other prisoners, or by tending to a wounded friend, or by teaching a young man how to survive the next election. Work, even in hell, can be improvised. The second is meaningful love. Someone to care for. A person whose existence justifies yours. A partner, a child, a parent, a friend. Someone whose thriving is part of your reason for continuing. In the camps, the love is often for a person on the outside, or for the memory of someone lost. But the love is real, and it is load-bearing. Frankl himself, during his Koffering months, sustains himself in part through an imagined conversation with Tilly. He does not know she is dead. He speaks to her in his head along the barbed wire. She speaks back, and somehow, impossibly, this conversation nourishes him. The third is the hardest. The third is meaningful attitude toward unavoidable suffering. The stance you take when the suffering is not going to stop, and you cannot change it, and the only freedom left to you is the freedom to choose how you will face it. The Stoics had this. The Buddhists had this. But Frankl, in the camps, sees it not as an abstract philosophical stance, but as an observable clinical variable. Some men face their suffering with dignity, some with resignation, some with bitterness, some with a kind of quiet, brave curiosity. And the way they faced it, Frankl saw, shaped their survival, their interior life, and their slow death in ways he could almost chart. He formulates these 3 sources in his head across the months. He has no paper, no pen. He writes on the inside of his skull, again and again, creating, loving, and meaning-making in the face of unavoidable suffering. These three, and if any one of them is still available, a person has a reason to live. Somewhere in the winter of 1944, he contracts typhus. The lice that torment every prisoner in Kaufering have carried it to him. Fever, delirium, the disease that is killing thousands of prisoners. He becomes convinced somewhere in the fever that he is going to die. And he decides, with the last of his clarity, that he will not die with the manuscript unwritten. He begs, borrows, and steals scraps of paper, the backs of torn Nazi forms, orderly sheets, camp documents, anything with a blank surface. He writes in tiny, tiny script, because each scrap is precious. He reconstructs the lost book, from memory. In fever, in the dark, with a stub of pencil, line by line, page by page, not the entire book, but the core of it, the three sources, the premise, the defense of meaning. He does this, as far as I can tell, for one reason. Because writing is his form of staying human. He is choosing, in the middle of dying, to create something. He is choosing meaningful work. He is performing his own theory on himself, while he is both the physician and the patient, and he is slowly surviving. April 27th, 1945. American forces liberate Kaufering 3. Viktor Frankl is alive. He weighs, by some reports, around 90 pounds. He can barely walk. But he is alive, and he has, in the ragged pockets of his prisoner's uniform, fragments of manuscript written on stolen Nazi paper. The liberation is not clean relief. He learns over the following weeks and months the scale of his loss. His father Gabriel has died in Theresienstadt. His mother Elsa has been gassed in Auschwitz. His brother Walter has been killed. His wife Tilly has died in Bergen-Belsen. Of his immediate family, only his sister Stella, who had emigrated to Australia before the war, survives. He returns to Vienna in August 1945. The city is rubble. His old apartment is gone. His old practice is gone. His old community, most of them are dead. He goes to old friends, to anyone still alive, and he asks for what you would ask for if you had just come back from hell. A room, a meal, a piece of paper, and he sits down to write. He writes Man's Search for Meaning in 9 days. 9. He does not write it by hand. He dictates it pacing to 3 stenographers who work in shifts. It pours out of him, the whole thing. The camp experience in the first half. The theory of logotherapy in the second half. The 3 sources of meaning. The central claim that man's primary motivation is not pleasure, as Freud taught, and not power, as Adler taught, but meaning. The drive to find and to make meaning in whatever circumstances one is handed. The book is published in Vienna in 1946. It sells modestly at first. Then it is translated. Then it is translated into every major language. Today, it has sold over 16 million copies in more than 50 languages. It is on the short list of books Americans name when they are asked what book changed their lives. It has been read by prisoners and presidents, and priests and atheists and soldiers and therapists and teenagers lying on their beds at 2 a.m, trying to figure out what the point of anything is. Frankl lives until 1997. He is 92 when he dies. He practices as a psychiatrist until nearly the end. He lectures in more than 200 universities. He founds the Viktor Frankl Institute in Vienna. He climbs mountains into his 80s. He falls in love again, marries a woman named Ellie, has a daughter. He lives, in the second half of his life, the fullest possible rebuttal of the argument that suffering destroys a person. The suffering shaped him. The suffering did not destroy him. The meaning, it turned out, was load-bearing. And here is what I want to say to you quietly, before we leave this story. You have almost certainly not been through Auschwitz. I have not. Most of us have not. And yet we live, many of us, with a low, quiet despair. A good life that feels hollow. A comfortable life that feels empty. The modern complaint, so common it has become a cliché. I have everything I wanted and I feel nothing. The strange grief of a life with no obvious wound and no obvious joy. Frankl, looking at us from across the distance of his experience, would not scold us. That was not his way. He would, I think, ask us 3 questions, gently, the way a good physician asks. Questions he built his own life on. What is one thing I could create this week? Not the great novel, not the world-changing project. One thing. A sentence, a piece of bread, a letter. A small handmade something that did not exist yesterday. What is one person I could care for? Not everyone. One. One person whose life, by the end of this week, is a little better because you turned toward them. What is one unchangeable thing in my life? And what attitude am I taking toward it? Because there is always one. Age, loss, a body that has limits, a past that cannot be rewritten. And the stance you take toward it is, in a way Frankl knew more deeply than almost anyone, your last and deepest freedom. Before you fall asleep tonight, ask yourself those 3. Just answer them. Write them down if you can. That's all. Do it once a week for a month. Answer the 3 questions. Watch what starts to shift. Because Frankl's thesis, in the end, is not complicated. You do not find meaning. You make it. And the making of it is the meaning. Your fingers, your voice, your attention turning toward the work and the people, and the unavoidable fact of your life. That is all. Viktor Frankl survived a concentration camp by discovering that meaning could be engineered even in hell. But most of us are not fighting death. We are fighting something quieter. Something modern. We are fighting exhaustion. And the next story comes from the most unexpected source, a gentle English naturalist who solved burnout in the 1840s, almost by accident. Now, to understand Charles Darwin, you have to understand how he came home. It was October 1836. The HMS Beagle pulled into Falmouth after 5 years at sea. A young man of 27 stepped off that ship, his pockets stuffed with notebooks, his mind already pulling at the edges of the idea that would one day crack open the whole Victorian worldview. He was healthy. He was ambitious. He was the golden boy of English science, and he knew it. He had the energy of a man who expected to work, the way Victorian gentlemen were meant to work. Long hours at the desk, evenings of correspondence, dinners with fellows of the Royal Society. a life of steady, productive labor, stretching ahead like a long, straight road. And then, somewhere around 1839, the road began to crack. It started small, a flutter in the chest during dinner, stomach pains that came and went, a strange swimming sensation behind the eyes after a long morning of work. He thought it would pass. It did not pass. By his mid-30s, Darwin was a man living inside a symptom list, heart palpitations that woke him at night, stomach cramps so severe he would vomit after any serious intellectual effort, dizziness, headaches, a trembling he could not explain. His father was a physician, his uncle was a physician. A whole bench of Victorian doctors weighed in, and not one of them could name the illness. Modern doctors, looking back, have a few theories. Some think he contracted Chagas disease in South America, from the bite of a triatomine bug during the Beagle voyage. Some think it was a severe panic disorder, triggered by intellectual stress and deepened by the secret weight of the theory he was quietly building. Some think he was lactose intolerant and never knew it. The honest answer is probably all three stacked on top of each other. But the label does not matter. What matters is what the illness did. It made him, by the standards of his age, a broken man. A Victorian scientist who could not work Victorian hours. He tried at first to push through, and every time his body sent him a bill, a week of vomiting, a night of palpitations, a day of lying on the couch unable to see straight. He thought, at this point, that his career was over. His friends feared the same. And in this, night friend, he was not alone. You know this feeling. Not the Victorian details, but the core of it. That creeping sense that your body is refusing the work your mind insists on. That the machine you used to run on, that ran on coffee and ambition and sheer obstinacy, has started to send you strange signals you cannot ignore. He did not know it yet. But his illness was about to become his method. In 1842, Darwin did something his London colleagues saw as a kind of retreat. He bought a country house, a rambling old parsonage in the village of Down, in Kent, 16 miles from central London, just far enough that the post arrived slowly. Just close enough to reach the city when he absolutely had to. He moved in with his wife Emma, and they would raise 10 children in that house. He would never leave it, really, for the rest of his life. He died there, 40 years later. And in that house, he built himself a schedule. Not a Victorian schedule. A schedule that fit his sick, unreliable body like a well-made coat. It went roughly like this. He woke early. He walked before breakfast, often alone. Breakfast at 8. And then, from 8 to 9:30, he did his hardest work of the day. Focused writing, real thinking. 90 minutes of the kind of effort that moved the theory forward. At 9:30, he stopped. Not because he was done, because his body could not sustain that kind of work longer. He would answer correspondence for about an hour. Slower work, the kind of thing a sick man can do lying half sideways on a sofa, if need be. Then he walked, the famous sand walk. It was a sand-covered path at the edge of his property, roughly 400 yards long, looping around a small wooded strip he had planted himself. He called it his thinking path. He walked it not once, but 5 or 6 or 7 times a day. He would place a pile of flint stones at the turn of the path and knock one aside with his walking stick each time he completed a loop, so he did not have to count. Back from the sandwalk around 11, he settled into his second block of focused work. Another 90 minutes, give or take. At 12:30, he stopped, for good. No more serious thinking for the day. Lunch. Then a rest on the sofa while Emma read to him from a novel. He loved novels. He loved especially romances with happy endings. He had strong opinions about this. A novel with a sad ending, he said, should not be published. A man of science, you see, apparently has strong and specific literary preferences. After the reading, he would nap. Actually nap. Not pretend rest. Sleep. Now, Darwin napped after lunch. Not because he was old, because he was a man of science, which, as a category, is apparently much more consistent with naps than modern LinkedIn would have you believe. After the nap, another walk. Maybe a third short block of work from 4 to 5. Tea. Family time. Dinner. Games with the children. Emma at the piano. In bed by 10:30. Total focused intellectual work per day. Give or take, about 4 hours. Split into 2 or 3 short blocks, each no longer than about 90 minutes. Plus roughly 2 hours of walking. Plus a nap. Plus novels. Plus dinner with his wife and children. By any Victorian gentleman scientist standard, this was embarrassing. His colleagues in London worked 10, 12, 14 hours a day at their desks, the way serious men were meant to. Darwin worked 4. His letters sometimes apologize for it. He calls himself an invalid. He hints that he is not really contributing as he should. But see, something was happening inside that schedule that he did not yet have words for. He was not wasting the other 20 hours. The walk was part of the work. The novel was part of the work. The nap was part of the work. The long evenings with Emma and the children were part of the work. He did not know he was intuitively tracking what modern science would later call the ultradian rhythm. He did not know he was naturally splitting his cognitive day into the roughly 90-minute blocks that researchers would one day measure in laboratories. He only knew that if he worked longer than about an hour and a half at a stretch, he would vomit. And if he worked less, he would produce more. So he listened to his body, because it was frankly the only body he had. And 40 years later, this sick man, working 4 hours a day in a country house with a sand path and a sofa, would produce the single most important biological work of the 19th century. Here is what the sandwalk built. For 20 years, Darwin kept to this schedule. Morning block. Sandwalk. Second block. Lunch, nap, novels. Another short block, if he had it in him. Dinner, bed, repeat day after day, year after year, through illnesses and remissions, through the births of his children and the terrible death of his daughter Annie at 10, which broke something in him he would never quite repair. He was building a theory, slowly, letter by letter, specimen by specimen. Barnacles, of all things, for 8 years, just to understand variation within a species, earthworms, pigeons bred in his own coops, orchids, a slow, patient pattern-finding accumulation that no one but a man stuck at home could have managed. He had written a 35-page sketch of his theory as early as 1842. He expanded it to a 230-page essay in 1844. And then he sat on it for 15 more years, terrified, frankly, terrified of the religious reaction, terrified of what it would do to his wife Emma, who was a devout Christian. In 1858, a letter arrived at Down House from a younger naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, working in what is now Indonesia. Wallace had independently worked out almost exactly the same theory. He was asking Darwin, as the respected senior man, for his opinion. Darwin nearly fainted. 20 years of careful private work. And here was a stranger with the same idea, ready to publish. His friends rushed him. Lyell and Hooker arranged a joint presentation to the Linnean Society in July of 1858. Darwin did not even attend. He was at home, sick, and his baby son, Charles Waring, had just died of scarlet fever. And then, in 15 months of pushed, concentrated effort, Darwin did the impossible. He distilled 20 years of sandwalk-built theory into a single book. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, published November 24, 1859. The first print run was 1,250 copies. Every single copy sold on the first day. 6 editions in Darwin's own lifetime. The Victorian world, which had told him he was too sick to do serious work, found itself permanently rearranged by a man who worked 4 hours a day. He kept writing The Descent of Man, a book on orchids, a book on earthworms, his last, published in 1881, the year before he died. Through all of it, the schedule: morning block, sandwalk, second block, nap, novels, 4 hours a day. He died at Down House on April 19th, 1882. He was 73. He is buried in Westminster Abbey, a few feet from Sir Isaac Newton, which is about as high a scientific compliment as England knows how to pay. And here is the strange thing. He himself always called his schedule a limitation. He apologized for it even near the end. He once wrote that he wished he could have worked longer, that he might have done more. The joke, in hindsight, is that he could not have done more. The schedule is what did it. The 4 hours were not a ceiling. They were the fuel. The walks and the naps and the novels were not the breaks from the work. They were the work, continuing by other means. He thought his illness was stealing his career. Instead, it handed him the only method by which his career could have happened. Now, here is where the story gets interesting for you. Because for about 150 years, Darwin's schedule was treated as a quaint Victorian footnote, the oddity of a sickly genius. Modern productivity culture, especially in the last 50 years, went in the exact opposite direction. 80-hour work weeks, grinding through, hustle, rise and grind. The man who works longest wins. And then, slowly, the research started catching up to Darwin. In 1993, a Swedish-American psychologist named Anders Ericsson published a study that changed how we think about expertise. He studied violinists at the Berlin Academy of Music, elite performers, middle performers, and the merely competent. Now, the famous line from his work, the one everyone quotes, is the 10,000 hours idea, later popularized by Malcolm Gladwell. But that is not the most interesting thing Ericsson found. The most interesting thing Ericsson found was how much of that 10,000 hours the elite performers did per day. Not 12 hours, not 8, not even 6. About 4, sometimes 4.5. He looked across domains. Chess grandmasters, elite athletes, master mathematicians, Nobel-winning scientists. The ceiling, over and over, was roughly the same. 3 to 5 hours of true, focused, deliberate practice per day, split into chunks with real rest in between. Beyond that, quality falls off a cliff. The extra hours do not add up. They subtract, which, if you think about it, is a description of Charles Darwin's life, with the names changed. And Ericsson was not alone. A researcher named Nathaniel Kleitman, back in the 1950s, had identified what he called the Basic Rest Activity Cycle, or BRAC. The human body runs on a rhythm of roughly 90 minutes. Alertness rises, alertness peaks, alertness falls. Then a trough of about 20 minutes, where the body wants rest. Then the cycle begins again, not just at night, all day. So when Darwin sat down to do his 90 minutes of hard thinking and then stopped and walked the sand walk, he was not being indulgent. He was riding the ultradian wave exactly the way the body wants to be ridden. Nap research is in the same family. A midday nap of 20 to 30 minutes restores alertness, consolidates memory, reduces cortisol. NASA studied it with pilots. Spanish siestas are not cultural weakness. They are cultural wisdom. The walking piece is the same. Research on the incubation effect in creative problem-solving shows that insights emerge not during focused work, but during the walk afterward. The default mode network of the brain, lighting up during unfocused movement, linking ideas across distant parts of the mind. Darwin did not know the term, but he walked his sandwalk 4 to 7 times a day. And the novels, which seem the silliest piece, turn out to matter too. Narrative fiction activates the regions of the brain involved in empathy, theory of mind, and pattern recognition. The novel does not merely relax, it repairs. So here is what we know, 150 years later. The schedule that looked like laziness was the single most efficient possible use of the human cognitive machine. It was not a workaround for his illness. It was a map his body drew for him because he was forced to listen. The burnout epidemic we are in right now, the one the World Health Organization formally recognized in 2019, is the bill coming due. We are a civilization of people working 10, 12, 14 hours a day, producing less and less per hour, feeling worse and worse inside, and telling ourselves that if we just push through, it will get better. Darwin is the counter-argument. 4 hours a day for 40 years. A theory that changed biology. A man who died at 73, having, in the only sense that matters, won. Now, I want to pause here, because this is where you come in. You listening tonight, chances are you know the particular flavor of exhaustion I'm talking about. Not the dramatic kind, not the concentration camp kind, just the quiet, low-grade, permanent kind. The kind where you wake up tired, drink coffee to be functional, work scattered through a day of meetings and notifications, and go to bed still carrying the feeling that you did not quite get enough done. So here is a small thing, from Darwin to you. Tomorrow, pick one block of the day to work for 90 minutes, just 90, with no phone, no email, nothing but the one hardest task in front of you. Then stop. Take a walk outside, not a podcast walk, a quiet walk. And then see what you produced in that 90 minutes compared to a scattered full day. Do it 3 times in 1 week. Just 3. Darwin did it every day for 40 years. You do not have to. Just try 3. Darwin figured out that the body, left alone, teaches you how to work. Our next story teaches us something similar, but about friendship. That the body, the community, the village, all of them know something we have forgotten, how to not be alone. To find this next story, you have to go to a string of small islands south of Japan. Warm ocean, volcanic soil, a soft, subtropical air that carries the smell of citrus and sea salt. The Ryukyu Islands. What we now call Okinawa. Now, in the 18th century, Okinawa was not yet part of modern Japan. It was an independent kingdom, the Ryukyu Kingdom, with its own language and its own court. The soil was thin, the weather was vicious, the sea gave food, but only to those who knew her, and she took lives too. And in the villages, especially the poor villages, nobody could survive alone. You have to understand what that meant. Not as a sentiment, as a fact. There was no bank. There was no insurance. There was no government pension. If your roof blew off in a typhoon, somebody had to help you rebuild it before the next rain. If the rice harvest failed, somebody had to share what they had. If a parent died, somebody had to take in the widow. The village was the safety net because there was no other net. So the villagers, slowly over generations, formalized what had already been happening informally. They built a little piece of social technology. They called it, in the local tongue, a moai. The word comes from older Japanese roots meaning roughly, a meeting for a common purpose. In its earliest form, it was a small mutual aid group, 5 or 6 people, usually formed in early childhood, the children of neighbors, paired up by the village elders, sometimes as early as age 5. These children would now be a moai, for life. At first, the purpose was financial. Each member would contribute a small amount of rice or money to a common pot each month. The pot would rotate. 1 month, one member would receive the pot to pay a debt, build a barn, bury a parent. Next month, a different member. In Japanese, these rotating credit systems had other names too, Tanamoshi, Mujin. But in Okinawa, the moai had an extra layer the others did not have. The extra layer was this: the group did not dissolve when the money was repaid. In other parts of the world, you pool funds with a group. You pay your debts, and you go your separate ways. In Okinawa, once the moai was formed, it was formed. For life. The children were paired at 5. They met monthly, sometimes weekly, through their entire lives, through schooling, through marriage, through births and deaths, through sickness, through widowhood, through the slow decline of old age. By the time the financial function faded over the 20th century, because banks and pensions had finally arrived, the social function had only deepened. The moai had become something more valuable than money. It had become a promise. The promise was simple. I will not disappear on you. Not when things are easy. Not when things are hard. Not when I am busy. Not when you are difficult. Not when the world pulls us in different directions. Once a month we meet. Once a week, if we can. And we will do this until one of us dies, and then the rest will keep doing it for the one who is gone. Now, in a world where the average modern American friendship lasts about 7 years before quietly dissolving, you may need a moment to let that sink in. A moai, by its nature, is a friendship that lasts 90 years. About half of modern Okinawans still participate in one. In a culture that has seen war and American occupation and the explosion of global consumerism and smartphones and everything else the 20th century threw at it, the moai survived. The rice pot is gone, but the group is still there. And in the quiet centenarian villages of northern Okinawa, you can still meet elderly women in their 90s and 100s who have been meeting the same 4 or 5 friends every Tuesday afternoon since they were 6 years old. That is not a friendship. That is an ecosystem. And here is what the research is beginning to tell us. That ecosystem may be the single most important reason Okinawa has, per capita, more centenarians than anywhere else on Earth. Now, you can imagine that a structure designed to hold a group of people together for 90 years needs some rules. It is not going to work on vibes alone. The rules of a moai, though never written down as a formal code, have been remarkably consistent across the islands and across the generations. Let me walk you through them, because they are surprisingly simple and surprisingly hard. Rule 1. You meet at the agreed time, no matter what. The meetings are not suggestions. They are not, let's grab coffee sometime. They are on the calendar, forever, at the same time, usually the same day of the month or the same afternoon of the week. You show up. If you are sick, you send word and you show up as soon as you are well. If your child is ill, someone else in the group helps with the child so you can come. If you are traveling, you plan around the meeting. The meeting is the immovable object in your life, and everything else flexes around it. Rule 2. You tell the truth. The moai is not a performance. It is the opposite. You bring the real story. The crop failure, the sick husband, the daughter who will not speak to you, the fear, the grief, the shame, because the whole structure only works if the people inside it know what is actually going on. If you hide, the moai cannot help. If you lie, the moai cannot help. So you tell the truth, and the others tell theirs, and the group holds what cannot be held alone. Rule 3. You contribute what you can. Sometimes that is money. Sometimes it is rice. Sometimes it is labor. Sometimes it is an ear. For an hour. For a friend who cannot stop crying. The contribution is not equal. It is proportional. The wealthy friend gives more money. The strong friend gives more labor. The quiet friend gives more listening. The cheerful friend gives more joy. Over a lifetime, it all evens out. Over a month, it does not have to. Rule 4. You do not flake. You do not take a break from friendship for career reasons. You do not disappear for a year because you got busy. You do not ghost. You do not quietly drift. If something is wrong, you bring it to the group. If the group is hurting you, you say so, but you do not vanish. Rule 5. Nobody leaves the group unless they die. This one is the hardest for modern ears to hear, because our culture is so deeply shaped by the idea of mobility and choice and reinvention. Of course, you might need a new friend group in your 40s. Of course, you might outgrow people. Of course, relationships end. The Moai says no. The Moai says you were paired when you were 5. You are in it for life. You will get tired of these people. You will be disappointed by these people. They will be disappointed by you. That is normal. That is what 90-year friendships are. They are not uninterrupted fondness. They are something more durable. They are a structure that survives the fondness coming and going. Dan Burtner, the researcher and journalist who coined the term blue zones for the 5 regions of the world with the highest concentrations of centenarians, spent years documenting Okinawan Moai. He found groups that had been meeting continuously for over 90 years. He sat with a Moai of 5 women in the village of Ojimi, all in their 90s. They had been paired as children in the 1910s. Between them, they had buried 3 husbands. They had survived the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, one of the most brutal land battles in the Pacific War. They had rebuilt their village after the war together. They had watched Okinawa become part of Japan, then the American occupation, then back to Japan, all of it in the same group. When Burtner asked them what their secret was, they did not say diet. They did not say exercise. They said, "We have each other." And here, I promised you a joke, and I owe you one. In modern America, staying friends for 90 years is considered a miracle. In Okinawa, it is considered Tuesday. Now, Burtner and his team did not stop at the anecdotes. They went into the data. Because the claim that Moai membership actually extends life is a big claim, and a researcher has to prove it. They looked at the 4 identified longevity factors of Okinawa. The locals call them loosely the 4 Horai, though the specific term varies. 1. Diet. Mostly plant-based, a lot of sweet potato, a principle called Hara Hachibu, which means you stop eating when you are 80% full. 2. Purpose. What the Okinawans call ikigai. A word we will return to in the second half of our tale. 3. Movement, not gym exercise, gardening, walking to the market, carrying grandchildren. Natural, daily, low-intensity motion. And 4. Social connection. The Moai. And when the Blue Zones researchers statistically teased apart those 4 factors, looking at which ones seemed to do the most work, the Moai kept coming out on top. Or tied for top. Not diet, not exercise, not even ikigai, important as it is. The thing that seemed to matter most, the thing that most distinguished centenarians from people who died in their 70s, was whether or not they had a stable, lifelong group of friends. Which is, if you think about it, almost the opposite of how our culture talks about longevity. We talk about diet. We talk about supplements. We talk about exercise regimens. We talk about sleep. We talk about biohacking. We talk about cold plunges and infrared saunas and intermittent fasting. We rarely, if ever, talk about the fact that the single most powerful predictor of how long you will live across almost every major study is a simple count. How many people in your life would notice and care if you disappeared for a week? In 2023, the United States Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, issued a formal public advisory on loneliness. A rare thing for a Surgeon General to do. Loneliness, he declared, was a public health crisis. The health impact of chronic loneliness, the advisory said, is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Let that land. 15 cigarettes a day, every day, for the rest of your life. That is what the absence of a moai is doing inside the body of the average lonely modern human. Loneliness raises the risk of cardiovascular disease. It raises the risk of dementia. It raises the risk of stroke. It suppresses the immune system. It dysregulates sleep. It increases cortisol. It is, as the Surgeon General put it, almost perfectly correlated with early death. The Harvard Study of Adult Development, which has been running now for over 85 years, following a cohort of men first recruited in 1938 and later including their wives and children, has come to, essentially, the same conclusion. The longest-running scientific study of human happiness in history. And its headline finding, in the words of its current director, Dr. Robert Waldinger, is this: the quality of your relationships at age 50 is a better predictor of your physical health at age 80 than your cholesterol levels. So the scientific finding is, in fact, the Okinawan finding, just dressed up in English, and Kaplan-Meier curves. And the research goes further. Not any relationships, structured relationships. Relationships with rhythm and obligation and predictable contact. Loose, flexible, occasional friendships are better than isolation, but they are not statistically nearly as protective as the Moai-style bond. The bond with a fixed meeting, with rules, with the unspoken knowledge that you will not be abandoned. This is the part our culture has almost entirely forgotten. We have plenty of people we know. We have hundreds of friends on our phones. We have colleagues and acquaintances and neighbors we wave to. What we do not have, most of us, is 4 specific people who have a standing appointment with us that nothing can move. And the absence of those 4 people, quietly, steadily, is taking years off of our lives. Now, the beautiful thing about the moai is how simple it is. You do not need to live in Okinawa. You do not need to speak Japanese. You do not need to eat sweet potato or practice harahachi-bu. You do not need anyone's permission. You do not need a tradition going back 300 years. What you need is 4 people, a time, a place, and a rule. That is it. 4 people you actually like and want in your life for the long haul. Does not have to be your closest friends right now. Does not have to be people you have known forever. Could be neighbors. Could be people from a hobby. Could be old college friends you have not seen in 5 years. Could be a group of parents whose children are the same age. Could be the 3 other people at work you eat lunch with. It just has to be 4, give or take, because 6 is too many, and 2 is too few. A time. 1 evening a month, minimum. Better if it is weekly, if you can. Same time, same day. The last Thursday of every month. The second Sunday afternoon. Whatever. It goes on the calendar forever, and it does not move. A place. Somebody's kitchen table is ideal. A restaurant works. A bench in a park works. The place matters less than the time. And a rule. One rule. When we meet, we bring the real story, not the performance, the real one. That is the whole moai. People have started to rebuild this in quiet corners of the modern world. There are startup founders doing moai groups for accountability, 4 of them at the same career stage, meeting every 2 weeks for a decade, supporting each other through funding rounds and failures and successes. There are parents in suburban neighborhoods forming dinner party moai, rotating through each other's houses one Friday a month. There are recovery groups doing it, church groups doing it, reading groups doing it. People who have rediscovered, often by accident, what Okinawan grandmothers knew when they were 6 years old. The sociologist Ray Oldenburg, back in 1989, wrote a book called The Great Good Place. He argued that a healthy community needs 3 spaces. The first space is home. The second is work. The third is the third place. The neighborhood bar, the barber shop, the coffee house, the park bench, where people gather without agenda and with regularity. And the collapse of the third place, he warned, would be the collapse of everything else. He was right. We have, over the last 50 years, mostly lost our third places. Shopping malls have replaced town squares. Television replaced front porches. Smartphones replaced coffee shops. And in the empty space where the third place used to be, loneliness rushed in. The moai, though, is not a place. It is a people. You can have a moai without a third place, if you keep the 4 people and the time. The people are the place. And once you have built it, the beautiful, unexpected thing is how little maintenance it takes. It does not require constant scheduling. It does not require texting back and forth every week to see if everyone can make it. It just runs. Second Tuesday of the month, 7 p.m. Mary's house. Done. See you there. In 10 years, in 30, in 50, for as long as you all are breathing. The Okinawans solved loneliness by engineering community. But what about the problem underneath loneliness? The problem of not knowing who you are in the first place. For that, we have to go much further back. 50,000 years back. To an ancient tradition that solved the identity crisis before it was a crisis. Now, I want you to do something for a moment. I want you to close your eyes, if you can, or at least let them soften. And I want you to think about how long people have been living in the place where you live. If you are in most of Europe, maybe a few thousand years. If you are in most of North America, the indigenous history goes back perhaps 15,000 years, with deep debates among archaeologists about earlier dates. In most of Asia and Africa, depending on where exactly, tens of thousands. Now let your mind travel south, across the Indian Ocean to a large red continent, shaped like a shield, most of it desert, ringed with coastlines and eucalyptus forests, and strange, beautiful creatures that exist nowhere else on Earth. Australia. And on that continent, a people who have been there for at least 65,000 years. Some researchers argue it may be even longer. 65,000 years. Now, let me put that in perspective. Modern humans left Africa roughly 70,000 years ago. These people arrived in Australia not long after. They crossed land bridges and open water that no one thought was crossable. And then, crucially, they stayed. They did not leave. They did not get displaced. They did not get colonized out of existence. They endured ice ages. They endured the rising of the seas. They endured the arrival of British colonists in 1788 with rifles and smallpox and the doctrine that the continent was terra nullius, nobody's land. Through all of it, they stayed. Which means, in 2026, there is no older continuously living culture on Earth than the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. Not in China, not in India, not in Mesopotamia, nowhere. 65,000 years of unbroken story. And we need to approach this story with reverence, because we are about to touch on spiritual practices that are sacred to a people who have every right to guard them. And much of what they know is not fully shared with outsiders, and rightly so. What I can tell you is what has been shared in the respectful anthropological record and in the writings of Aboriginal elders who have chosen to share. And what I will not try to do is pretend I know the things that are not mine to know. The foundation of their worldview, though they do not all use the same word for it, is often translated into English as the dreaming. In the Pitjantjatjara language, the word is chukurpa. In others, Wongar or Altjira, or many more. The dreaming is not a time. It is not really a place. It is a dimension. It is the sacred layer that underlies ordinary reality. In the dreaming, the ancestral beings walked the continent and shaped it. A great serpent carved a river. A goanna lizard sang a ridge into being. A Seven Sisters constellation fled a hunter across the sky and left stories in the rocks below. The land in this worldview is not scenery. It is text. Every rock, every waterhole, every stand of trees, every ridge, every bend in a river is a letter in an enormous story. A story that is alive, a story that is still being told, and the song lines are how you read it. A song line is an invisible path across the continent, recorded entirely in song. Each verse of the song describes the geography of the next mile. The rocks you will pass, the water you will find, the safe camping ground, the sacred site you do not enter, the spirits that live in that country. A man who knows the right songline can walk 1,000 miles across the outback, with no map, no compass, no signage, navigating only by the music in his head. Some songlines stretch over 2,000 kilometers. Some cross the territories of multiple language groups, handed off at the borders from one people to another, like a relay baton of song. A man on one side of the continent knows his piece of the line. A man on the other side knows his. The whole line exists because the whole continent sings it. The writer Bruce Chatwin, in his 1987 book, The Songlines, tried to give Western readers a glimpse of this. His book is imperfect. The elders he talked to gave him what they were willing to give him, and he wove around it his own speculations. But what he caught, what he could not unsee, was the scale of it, the staggering, impossible scale, an entire continent as a sung library, tens of thousands of years old, still being recited by grandmothers and grandfathers in the year of modern iPhones. It is into this world, this singing continent, that a young boy is sent. The practice we call, in English, walkabout, is not a single uniform rite. It varies enormously by clan, by language group, by desert or coast, by family tradition. What I am telling you is a composite, drawn from what has been shared. Specific clans do it specific ways, and those specifics are theirs. But across many clans, there comes a time, usually somewhere between the ages of about 10 and 16, when a boy is taken aside by the men of his family. Grandfathers, uncles, elders. His father sometimes, but often not primarily. The men tell him it is time. They do not tell him much more than that. He is given instruction. Some of it has been going on his whole life. How to find water, how to track an animal, how to read the sky, how to identify edible plants, how to read the signs of the songs his mothers and grandmothers have been singing to him since infancy. The instruction intensifies as he gets closer to the time. And then, often with a ceremony, often with a painting of his body in ochre, often with a specific fasting or a specific silence, he is sent. Alone, or sometimes with a single companion. Into the bush, into the outback, into the country that his people have walked for 65,000 years, and that he has, so far, only walked with his family. He carries usually almost nothing. A spear, a small kulamon, a wooden dish. Perhaps some fire-making tools, though many boys are expected to make fire from nothing if the land provides. A few ritual objects and the song lines. The song lines are his map. The song lines are his grocery store. The song lines are his history book. The song lines are his GPS. Everything he needs to know is held inside the music he has been memorizing his entire childhood. And now, for the first time, he sings it for himself, with no one to correct him. He walks for weeks, sometimes months, in some traditions as long as 6 months. He finds water where the song says there will be water, or he does not, and he learns what that means. He sees spirits, or what the tradition describes as spirits, in the long silences of the desert nights. He meets somewhere in the vast red expanse himself. This is not a survival retreat. This is not a modern wilderness camp. This is not team building. It is a spiritual undertaking of the most serious kind. The boy is being shown, slowly, without human companionship, what is inside him when no one is watching. He is being confronted with his own mind, unfiltered, in a landscape so old and so quiet that nothing can distract him from the encounter. Some boys are broken by it. Most are not. Most emerge months later at some agreed meeting point, with a dustier face and a thinner body, and something else behind their eyes. Something that was not there before. Because the thing he has met out there is not the land. The land was just the mirror. The thing he has met is himself. Now, here is where the story gets quieter and more private, and I will move carefully. Somewhere on the walkabout, the boy is expected to receive a spiritual name, not from his mother, not from his father, not from his uncles, from the dreaming itself, from the country. This is often tied to a specific moment, a vision, a dream, an unusual encounter with an animal, a particular wind, a rock that spoke to him in the way the songs had said it would. Some boys know it immediately. Some carry the question for weeks and receive the name only near the end. The name is not his ordinary name. He will still be called in camp, whatever his mother called him when he was a small child. But the new name is his true name, in the deeper sense. It is the name the land gave him. It is often secret. It is often shared only with the elders, and only when the elders judge him ready. Alongside the name, many boys receive a totem, an animal, a plant, a star. The totem becomes part of him. He may have a lifelong taboo against harming that species. He may have a lifelong obligation to care for it. The totem is not a hobby. It is not a mascot. It is a relationship with another living kind, given to him by the land, to carry for the rest of his life. When he returns to camp, he is different. Not because he has survived, because he has been named. The name signifies that he has met the thing beneath the clan. He is not merely a son of his mother and father. He is a son of the country. He is a son of the dreaming. He belongs to a story that is older than his parents, older than his grandparents, older than his people's memory in the human sense. He is the elders' judge, a man. Now, I want you to notice something, because this is important. In the Aboriginal model, identity is not something you construct. It is not something you choose. It is not something you decide, after a long period of self-exploration, in your 20s, to finally become. Identity is something the land gives you, after a long period of being emptied out enough to receive it. It is an inheritance from place. It is not a performance. You do not find yourself. You are found by the country. Now compare this for a moment with the way our modern culture forms identity. A modern child grows up surrounded, almost constantly, by an audience. Parents taking photos for family group chats. Extended family watching on social media. Teachers and classmates at school. Coaches, tutors, friends' parents, friends. Other children. Other children's other children. By the time a modern child is old enough to form a sense of self, that self has been observed, documented, commented on, and reflected back through 1,000 tiny mirrors since before the child could speak. Then comes adolescence. The phone arrives. Average age now, worldwide, is about 10. By 11, the child is on social media. Every feeling is performed. Every outfit is documented. Every friendship is publicly archived. The identity being built is being built for the audience, not from the inside out. The child does not know which thoughts are theirs, and which are anticipations of how the thought will look to others. By the time this child is a young adult, many of them have literally never been alone. Not truly alone. They have had moments of physical solitude, sure, but not psychological solitude. There has always been a phone in their pocket. There has always been a notification. There has always been a group chat to check, a video to put on, a podcast to queue up, an AI to talk to. The inside of the mind has been externally furnished for their entire lives. And then, in their 20s, we ask them, "Who are you?" And they panic. They do not know. Not because they are shallow, Not because they are weak, because they have never been given the conditions in which knowing is possible. They go on trips. They find themselves in Thailand. They try a new haircut. They try a new career. They journal. They take personality tests. They collect labels. I'm an introvert with extroverted tendencies. I'm a 4 on the Enneagram. I'm a Hufflepuff. I'm a classic eldest daughter. I'm an ambivert. They gather these labels like a person gathering umbrellas in a rainstorm, hoping one of them will be enough. None of them are enough. Because identity, in the Aboriginal sense, is not a label. It is an encounter. And a generation that has never been alone cannot have the encounter. Modern culture has the opposite of walkabout. We call it Instagram, the curated self, the performance self, the self that exists only when seen. A version of you that has been so thoroughly co-produced by your audience that you can no longer find the line between what you think and what you think other people want you to think. And here is the question you have to let yourself feel for a moment. When was the last time you were alone? Not alone with a podcast, not alone with a book, not alone in the car with the radio on, not alone with your phone in your hand, even face down. Truly, deeply alone, with nothing between you and the inside of your own mind. For many of us, the honest answer is years, sometimes more, which is why the walkabout still matters, not as a practice we can adopt. It is not ours, and we cannot strip it from its context and call it a wellness retreat. But as a reminder, as a diagnosis, the Aboriginal elders, for 65,000 years, knew something our culture has almost entirely forgotten, that the self can only be met in the absence of performance, that the audience has to go silent before the soul will speak. You cannot hear the country if you are talking over it. You cannot meet yourself if you are performing yourself. So here is your fireside for Story 6. You do not have to walk into the Australian outback. You do not have to vanish for 6 months. What you have to do is infinitely smaller and infinitely harder. Take one walk this week, alone. No phone, no podcast. 1 hour minimum. Go somewhere without an audience, not for exercise, not to think, just to be there. See who shows up inside you when there is no one to perform for. 1 hour alone, once a week. That is the modern walkabout. That is the minimum dose of yourself. Aboriginal walkabout strips away external identity to reveal the inner self. Our last story of this first half strips away something even more fundamental, the compulsion that drives most of modern life. A 2,500-year-old diagnosis of addiction that modern neuroscience has only just confirmed. Let us go to a deer park at the edge of a small Indian town, around 2,500 years ago. The town is called Sarnath. It sits on the plain of the Ganges, near the holy city of Varanasi. The year, by traditional dating, is around 528 BCE. Some modern scholars put it closer to 480 BCE. The precise date is contested, but the place is not. People still go to that deer park today. On that day, a thin, tired, sun-browned man, with a shaved head and a simple robe, sat down under a tree. He was about 35 years old. He had spent the last 6 years nearly killing himself with extreme spiritual practice, starving down to a skeleton, meditating to the point of collapse. He had recently, against the wishes of his companions, given all that up. He had accepted a bowl of food from a village woman. He had gone off on his own. And then, under a different tree many miles away, under a peepul, a fig tree, he had, according to the tradition, finally seen what he had been looking for. He was now, his followers would later say, the Buddha, the awakened one. His given name had been Siddhartha Gautama. His spiritual title was now something larger. And he had come to Sarnath to find 5 old friends. Now, these 5 men had been his companions in the extreme ascetic phase. Their names, preserved in the Pali tradition, were Kondana, Padya, Vapa, Mahanama, and Asaji. They had walked away from him in disgust when he had accepted the bowl of rice pudding from the village woman. They had believed, as he had once believed, that liberation required starving the body to nothing. When he had eaten, they had called him a backslider. They had gone their own way. And here he was, finding them again, because he wanted to tell them he had been wrong, and they had been wrong, and he had found the real thing. They were, at first, hostile. They saw him coming across the park and agreed, quietly, not to stand in his honor, not to offer him water, not to give him the respect a teacher deserved. He was, in their eyes, a failure. But something in his face, in how he walked, stopped them. Without quite meaning to, they rose. They took his bowl, they offered him water, and he sat down, under a tree, and he gave his first sermon. The sermon has a name in the Pali texts. The Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the setting of the wheel of the Dhamma in motion. It is short. It is the length of a modern pamphlet. But what it contains, laid out in 4 simple lines, is the foundation of everything that 2.5 millennia of Buddhism would build on top of it. He told them there were 4 noble truths. 1. Life contains dukkha. The word is usually translated suffering, but it is more subtle than that. It is more like unsatisfactoriness. It is the quality of a life that never quite sits right. The friction, the itch, the feeling that something is always slightly wrong, even when everything is going well. 2. Dukkha has a cause, and the cause, he said, is tanha, craving, thirst, grasping, the mind's compulsive reach for the next thing. 3. Dukkha can end. There is a cessation. You are not sentenced to it forever. 4. The way to that cessation is a path. What he called the Noble Eightfold Path. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Now, we could spend 8 videos on the Noble Eightfold Path, and someday we probably will. Tonight, for this story, I want you to focus only on the second truth, the one that names the cause, tanha, because the second truth, if you really hear it, is the most accurate diagnosis of modern addiction ever spoken. 2,500 years before we had the word addiction, before we had brain scans, before we had dopamine, before we had Instagram. He had already seen the whole thing, and his metaphor for it was salt water. Here is the image the Buddha used. Imagine a man who is terribly thirsty. Thirsty in the way that a man in a desert is thirsty. And imagine that instead of fresh water, what he is given is seawater, salt water. He drinks it. For a moment, the coolness hits his throat. For a moment, he feels the relief of drinking. His tongue is wet. His mouth is full. Something is happening. And then, almost immediately, the thirst comes back. Worse. Sharper. More urgent. Because salt water, when you drink it, does not quench thirst. It deepens thirst. The salt draws water out of your tissues. The more you drink, the more dehydrated you become. And so the more you drink, the more you want to drink. And if you do not understand the mechanism, you will drink and drink and drink, and you will die, and the last thing you will taste is the brine that you thought was going to save you. Tanha, the Buddha said, is exactly this. The mind feels a discomfort, an itch, a dullness, a low-grade dissatisfaction. The mind reaches for a sensation to relieve the discomfort. A mouthful of food, a sip of wine, a cigarette, a click, a scroll, a purchase, a sexual image, a hit of gossip, a hit of outrage, a hit of praise. The sensation arrives. For a moment the discomfort subsides. For a moment the mind is relieved. And then, almost immediately, the discomfort returns. Worse, sharper, more urgent, because the sensation did not quench the underlying thirst. It deepened it. Every time the mind reaches and is satisfied, the mind learns that reaching is what solves discomfort. The neural pathway gets stronger. The next craving comes faster and bigger and requires more to satisfy. This is the mechanism. This is the cage. It does not matter what the specific substance is: food, drink, drugs, sex, shopping, social media, gambling, work, achievement, approval. The mechanism is the same. The Buddha did not need to have seen an iPhone to know about iPhones. He had seen the reach, and the relief, and the return, and the deeper reach. That is all addiction has ever been, with the specific objects changing across the centuries. And here is where it gets almost spooky, because modern neuroscience, in the last 50 years, has looked inside the brain and found, essentially, the same story, written in cells. In the mid-20th century, researchers began mapping the brain's reward circuit, the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. It runs from the ventral tegmental area, a small cluster of cells deep in the midbrain, up to the nucleus accumbens, a structure in the forebrain associated with motivation and reward. When you do anything your brain considers rewarding, that pathway fires. Now, for a long time, people thought dopamine was about pleasure. That is what the popular press still mostly says. But the neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz, in his famous primate studies in the 1980s and 1990s, showed something far stranger and more precise. Dopamine is not really about pleasure. It is about prediction error. When you get a reward you did not expect, dopamine spikes high. When you get a reward exactly as expected, it barely twitches. When you expect a reward and do not get it, dopamine drops below baseline, and you feel worse than when you started. In other words, the system is not built to give you pleasure. It is built to drive you forward. It is built to make you keep reaching. Every app designer on Earth figured this out in the 2010s. The infinite scroll, the variable reward, the unpredictable like, the surprise notification. All of it is designed to hit the prediction error system, because prediction error, not pleasure, is what keeps you coming back. The Buddha did not know about Wolfram Schultz. He did not know about ventral tegmental areas. He had not read a paper on dopamine in his life, because dopamine had not yet been named. And yet, he had described the system perfectly. Every reach, he said, strengthens the reach. Every sip of salt water makes you thirstier. Every scroll makes the next scroll more necessary. Every swipe lowers the satisfaction of the one before. You are not going to solve the problem by finding better salt water. There is no such thing. You will solve it by understanding the salt. Now, once the Buddha named the problem, his prescription was radical and simple. He did not say, "Stop having cravings." Nobody can do that. Cravings arise. They arise in monks. They arise in saints. They arise in him, apparently too. A human nervous system is a craving-producing organ. You cannot turn it off any more than you can turn off your heart. What you can do, he said, is change your relationship to the craving. You can watch it without acting. This, in the terms of the Eightfold Path, is called right mindfulness. Sati in Pali. Awareness. The ability to observe what is happening in the mind without being swept away by it. And the most practical application of sati, for anyone caught in tanha, is what modern psychology now calls urge surfing. Here is how it works. The craving arises. You feel it. In your chest, usually. A pressure, a pulling, a reaching. You want to scroll. You want to drink. You want to open the fridge. You want to send the angry text. Before you act, you pause. You name it if you can. I am reaching. I am craving. The urge is here. You notice where it lives in your body, the pressure in your chest, the heat in your hands, the clenching in your jaw, the tingle in your fingers. You put your attention on the sensation itself, not on the thing it is demanding you do, and then you wait. Here is what almost nobody tells you. Cravings have a curve. They are not straight lines of increasing agony. They rise, they peak, and they fall. The rise is often fast. The peak often lasts seconds, maybe a minute. And then the whole thing, if you do not feed it, begins to dissolve. Dr. Jill Boulter Taylor, the neuroscientist who had a stroke and wrote about it in My Stroke of Insight, popularized what she called the 90-second rule. Any emotional reaction, biologically speaking, completes its chemical cycle in the bloodstream in about 90 seconds. After 90 seconds, whatever keeps it going is you, feeding it, rehearsing it, retelling it to yourself. If you stop feeding it, it fades. This is ancient. This is Vipassana meditation. This is what the Buddha taught at Sarnath. This is what monks in Burmese and Thai and Sri Lankan monasteries have been practicing for 2.5 millennia. Sit. Watch. Do not grasp. Do not push away. Just watch. The craving rises. The craving falls. You do not have to act. And in the last 25 years, clinical psychology has walked straight in. and started prescribing it. A researcher named Dr. Sarah Bowen at the University of Washington developed a program called Mindfulness-Based Relapse Prevention, or MBRP, in the early 2000s. It applies the Buddha's technique, stripped of its specifically religious framing, to addiction recovery. Heroin, alcohol, cocaine, nicotine, compulsive eating, compulsive gambling. The results, published in respected journals including JAMA Psychiatry, are striking. MBRP participants relapse at significantly lower rates than those in standard relapse prevention programs. The method works. The method is, when the craving comes, watch it. Let it peak. Let it pass. Then choose. This is the Buddha's second noble truth. In a clinic. Now, I want to bring this all the way home to your life tonight, because you may not think you have an addiction. The word is loaded. It sounds like it is for someone else, someone worse off, someone in a 12-step meeting in a church basement. But tanha is not a diagnosis. Tanha is a description of the ordinary mind. And if you are honest, you know it. The phone on the bedside table that you check before your eyes are fully open. That is tanha. The feed you scroll before bed, after you told yourself you would stop. That is tanha. The glass of wine at 5 p.m. that has slowly, quietly become 2. That is tanha. The food at 11, standing in front of the fridge, not hungry, not really tasting anything. That is tanha. The rage scroll through political news, feeling worse and worse, unable to stop. That is tanha. The shopping cart. The dating app. The sugar. The porn. The one more episode. The check the score one more time. All of it. Every single click. Every single reach. Tanha. The modern world did not invent addiction. It just built infinitely more sophisticated delivery systems for the same ancient thirst. The Buddha would look at a 21st century smartphone and, I suspect, be almost amused, not shocked. Amused, because we have taken the one thing he most carefully warned us about, and we have put it in our pockets, and we have engineered it to ring. The mindfulness industry, as of a couple of years ago, was estimated at around $1.5 billion in the United States alone. Headspace. Calm. Insight timer. All built, directly or indirectly, on Vipassana, on the Buddha's technique, 2,500 years old and repackaged for app stores. It works, imperfectly, but it works. The Buddha did not have Instagram, which is probably why he got so much work done. He built, in that deer park at Sarnath, a diagnosis so accurate that modern neuroscientists and clinical psychologists could walk into the Pali Canon 2,500 years later and essentially start prescribing from it. He did not solve all of human suffering. He never claimed to. What he did was name the engine, the reaching, the thirst, the salt water. And he told us simply how to watch it without drinking. Our first story of the second half brings us to America. To a sickly, asthmatic boy whose father looked at him one night and said something that would rebuild him from the ground up. New York City, October 27th, 1858. A boy is born into a brownstone on East 20th Street, into one of the great old Dutch families of the city. His name is Theodore Roosevelt Jr. His family calls him TD. and from almost the moment he can breathe, he cannot breathe. Asthma, in the 1860s, is not a condition. It is a verdict. There are no inhalers, no steroids, no emergency rooms. When a child's lungs close in the night, his family pours hot coffee down his throat because the caffeine sometimes loosens the chest. Or they wrap him in furs and race the horses through the dark streets of Manhattan because sometimes the motion and the wind break the attack before the boy suffocates. Now, think about being 6 years old, 7, 8, propped up on pillows because you cannot lie flat without drowning on dry land, listening to your own chest wheeze like a broken bellows. Watching your father, a man built like a barrel, cry in the doorway because he has no idea if you will see morning. That was T.D.'s childhood. The attacks came weekly, sometimes nightly. His father, Theodore Sr., a man the city of New York called Greatheart for his work with orphans and the poor, was a giant. Strong, bearded, loud with laughter, deeply kind. He would scoop his wheezing son up and run him down the street in his arms, just trying to get air moving through those little lungs. But the father knew something the son did not know yet. The body was failing. The mind was extraordinary. By 8, T.D. was teaching himself zoology from museum specimens. By 10, he could identify birds by call alone. The mind was a furnace. The body was a ruin. And so one evening, when T.D. was about 12 years old, his father sat him down in the library of the Roosevelt House. Well, the exact words have been preserved, because T.D. wrote them down and kept them with him for the rest of his life. The father said, "Theodore, you have the mind, but not the body, and without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body. It is hard drudgery to make one's body, but I know you will do it." Now stop there. Sit with that sentence. Look at it from every angle. Most modern fathers would do one of two things: coddle him, which teaches fragility, or shame him, which teaches self-hatred. Theodore Sr. did neither. He told his son the truth. Your body is failing you. Nobody is coming to fix it. You will fix it. And it will not be glamorous. It will be hard drudgery. Daily, small, boring, and you will do it. That is one of the great transfers of masculine expectation in the historical record. Not cruelty, not distance, certainty and love, which is the hardest combination a father can pull off. T.D. looked at his father, and T.D., 12 years old, wheezing, pale, narrow-chested, said in his small voice, "I'll make my body." And he did. But listen carefully to how he did it. Because this is the part everybody skips, and this is the part that actually matters. Theodore Sr. hired carpenters and turned the second-floor piazza of the Roosevelt House into a home gymnasium. Weights, parallel bars, pulleys, punching bags, a rowing frame. By the standards of 1872, it was an almost absurd setup. Most gymnasiums in America at that time were in YMCA basements, if they existed at all. But Greatheart built one in his own home, because he knew his son needed a daily place to do the work. and T.D. climbed onto those bars. Every day, chin-ups, push-ups, weighted swings. His arms were like twigs. He could barely hold himself. He fell, he coughed, he wheezed, and the next day he got back on. He took up boxing. See, T.D. got beaten in a stagecoach once by two older boys who recognized his weakness and tormented him for miles until he wept. He came home and asked his father to find him a boxing instructor. The instructor was a man named John Long, a retired prizefighter. Long would meet the boy and work with him for years. And T.D. boxed. He boxed through nosebleeds that would have stopped a grown man. He boxed until his knuckles cracked. He boxed even when the asthma was squeezing his chest, because he had decided at 12 that his body would obey his will, even if he had to drag it up every stair by the rail. Now, here's the thing about that kind of work. It does not feel heroic while you are doing it. It feels pathetic. It feels small. You do 10 push-ups and your arms shake. You do 15 the next day and you still look exactly the same. You do 20 the week after and your mother asks if you're feeling well because you look pale. There is no montage. There is no music. There is no moment where the clouds part and you are suddenly strong. There is only the drudgery the father warned him about. But T.D. stayed with it, year after year. Boxing, rowing, swimming, hiking in the Adirondacks, climbing, riding. He taught himself taxidermy and stalked birds through swamps so he could mount them for his amateur natural history collection, which meant long hours on his feet in cold water. Every activity he chose was secretly a physical training regimen, wearing the costume of a hobby. By the time he arrived at Harvard in 1876, he was no longer a frail boy. He was a compact, wiry young man with a bull neck and a barrel chest who boxed in the amateur circuit and won. His classmates called him a whirling dervish. They meant it admiringly. He was the boy who could not run a block at 10. He was, at 18, one of the most physically active young men on the Harvard campus. But listen, the asthma had not gone away. Not entirely. He still had attacks. He had them for his entire life. The difference was not that he had cured the disease. The difference was that he was stronger than the disease. He had built, through 20,000 repetitions of boring exercises, a body that simply refused to be defeated by its own broken parts. This is the distinction Western men keep missing. The work of becoming strong is not the work of fixing yourself. It is the work of building, around what is broken, something larger than the brokenness. Roosevelt's lungs were never whole. His muscles, his legs, his lungs working at reduced capacity, but reinforced by everything around them. Those he built. Well, by the end of his 20s, he had hiked, hunted, rode, ridden, and boxed his way into a body that most Americans would have envied. And he did it not through any miracle, not through any secret technique, not through any book with 5 easy steps. He did it through the dullest method known to human beings, daily, repetitive, small, for 20 years. Now, sit with this a moment. What Roosevelt proved in those 20 years between 12 and 30 is that the building of a man is not a peak experience. It is not a weekend retreat. It is not a 7-day challenge. It is a lifetime of showing up, and doing 15 boring repetitions. 1,000 small dull deposits. And then, one day, you have a body. And nobody who watches you stroll into a room can quite believe you were the frail boy who wheezed in the carriage 30 years ago. But the story does not end in triumph, because life does not end in triumph. Life, if you stay in it long enough, will test everything you have built. And in 1884, when Theodore was 25 years old, life came for him. February 14th, 1884, Valentine's Day. Teedy was a young New York State Assemblyman, climbing the political ladder at a rate that stunned older legislators. He had recently married a beautiful young woman named Alice Hathaway Lee. They were madly in love. She had just given birth 2 days earlier to their first child, a little girl. Theodore was in Albany, sitting in the legislature when the first telegram arrived. It told him the baby was fine, but Alice was not well. The second telegram, hours later, was more urgent. His wife was in grave danger. And then a third telegram. His mother, Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt, who lived in the same house as Alice, had also fallen ill. She had typhoid fever. He raced home to New York City. He arrived at the house on West 57th Street in the middle of a dense fog. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time. His mother, his Mitty, the Southern belle who had raised him, who had sung him through his asthma attacks. She died in his arms at 3 in the morning. He went upstairs to his wife. Alice had Bright's disease, kidney failure brought on by the pregnancy. She died in his arms at 2 in the afternoon. Both women. Same house, same day. 2 floors apart. Now, Theodore's diary for February 14th, 1884, is one of the most famous pages of private writing in American history. Because he opened the diary, and he drew a large black X across the page. Just an X. And underneath the X, he wrote one sentence. "The light has gone out of my life." That was all. No details, no grief recorded. Just a black X and one line. And then, for the rest of his life, he would almost never speak of Alice again. He would not use her name. He would not put her picture on his wall. He would raise their daughter, Alice Jr., and love her fiercely, but he would treat the name Alice as a sort of sacred wound that must not be touched. Some modern readers look at that and say, well, that's repression. That's unhealthy. That's the bad old Victorian way of handling grief. But look closer, because Theodore did not just bury the grief and keep going. He took it somewhere. He took it to the Dakota Badlands. Within months of the double funeral, he had left his baby daughter with his older sister and gone west. To the open plains of the Dakota Territory. He bought a cattle ranch. He called it Elkhorn. And for the next 2 years, he lived there as a cattleman. He rose at dawn. He rode horses 18 hours a day. He slept under the stars. He drove cattle through rivers. He hunted elk and bighorn sheep. And one night, in a saloon in a little frontier town called Mingersville, a drunk with 2 pistols swaggered up to the eastern tenderfoot with the spectacles and announced loudly that Four Eyes is going to set up the drinks." The other men in the saloon went quiet. They expected Roosevelt to apologize and buy a round or to retreat. Instead, Roosevelt stood up, smiled politely, and then fired a right hook into the drunk's jaw that knocked him across the room. The drunk staggered up, raised his pistols, and Roosevelt hit him again. Left, right, left. The drunk went down and stayed down. Roosevelt had the bartender drag the unconscious cowboy out behind the saloon and then, quietly, finished his drink. That punch was not macho posturing. That punch was grief moving through the body. That was Theodore Roosevelt taking the worst month of his entire life and converting it into the willingness to strike first at a loaded gun. Which, to be clear, I am not recommending as a therapeutic technique. I am merely observing it. He lost over half his cattle in the brutal winter of 1886 to 1887. What the prairie men called the Great Die-Up, where temperatures fell to 40 below zero, and the grass vanished under 8 feet of snow. Carcasses of his cows piled against the fences in drifts. He rode out in the spring, surveyed the ruin, and decided to come home. He returned to New York, remarried, raised his daughter, kept climbing, ran for mayor, lost, ran the U.S. Civil Service Commission, became Assistant Secretary of the Navy, charged up San Juan Hill with the Rough Riders, became Governor of New York, then Vice President. And in September of 1901, when President McKinley was assassinated, a 42-year-old Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as the 26th President of the United States. From the wheezing boy on the pillows to the man in the White House in 30 years. And now I must tell you the single most extraordinary physical event of Theodore Roosevelt's life, which, given the life, is saying something. October 14th, 1912. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Roosevelt is 53 years old. He has served his 2 terms as president and has hand-picked his successor, William Howard Taft. But he has fallen out with Taft. He feels Taft has abandoned the progressive agenda. So he has returned to politics, running for a 3rd term under a new party he himself founded. He has called it the Progressive Party. But everyone calls it the Bull Moose Party, because when a reporter asked him how he was feeling that summer, Roosevelt had roared, "I feel as fit as a bull moose." Well, this October evening he is campaigning in Milwaukee. He comes out of the Gilpatrick Hotel, climbs into an open car, stands up to wave at the crowd. In his coat pocket, he carries a folded 50-page manuscript of the speech he is about to give. Also, in his pocket, his steel eyeglass case. A man steps out of the crowd. His name is John Schrank. A 36-year-old saloon keeper from New York, mentally ill, convinced that the ghost of President McKinley has visited him and ordered him to prevent Roosevelt from serving a 3rd term. Schrank raises a Colt revolver. He fires once from 6 feet away, straight at Roosevelt's chest. The bullet strikes Roosevelt in the right breast. It punches through his overcoat. It punches through his suit coat. It punches through his folded 50-page manuscript, which slows it significantly. It clips the steel eyeglass case, which deflects it slightly. And then it strikes the muscle and bone of his chest wall and stops. It lodges there, an inch or 2 from his lung. But it does not go in. The paper and the metal have saved his life. Roosevelt staggers. The crowd seizes Schrank and is about to lynch him on the spot. Roosevelt shouts, "Don't hurt that man!" The man is dragged away. Now here is where other human beings would go to the hospital. Here is where a normal candidate says, "Look, my friends, I've been shot. The rally is cancelled. I'm bleeding. I'm sorry." But Roosevelt coughs into his hand. He examines the palm. No blood. And he reasons, in that moment, like a naturalist would reason, that if he is not coughing blood, then the bullet is not in his lung. And if the bullet is not in his lung, then he is not dying. Not immediately. And if he is not immediately dying, then the show goes on. He instructs his driver to take him to the Milwaukee auditorium. The car drives the 6 blocks. Roosevelt climbs out. He walks into the building. His blood-soaked shirt is sticking to his chest. His aides are begging him to sit down. He refuses. He walks to the stage. He reaches into his breast pocket and pulls out the folded 50-page manuscript. It has a hole punched straight through the center of it, and the last several pages are dark with his own blood. He holds it up so the audience can see the hole. He opens his coat so they can see the bloom of red soaking his white shirt. And then, in that voice his asthma had never quite conquered, Theodore Roosevelt says the line that has been carved into American memory. "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." And he proceeds to deliver the speech. The whole speech. 50 pages, 90 minutes, blood dripping onto the podium. Every now and then he sways, and one of his aides steps forward to steady him. He waves them off. He keeps speaking. About progressivism, about workers' rights, about reform, about the America he believes in. And when he finally finishes, he is taken to the hospital. The doctors examine him. They decide that removing the bullet is more dangerous than leaving it. And they leave it. And Roosevelt, the wheezing asthmatic boy whose father told him he must make his body, carries that bullet in his chest for the rest of his life. It is still in him when he dies, at his home in Oyster Bay, on January 6, 1919, at the age of 60. Now, I want you to think about what that moment in Milwaukee actually was. Because it was not bravery in the thrill-seeking sense. It was not showmanship. It was the accumulated dividend of 40 years of 15 push-ups at a time. 40 years of climbing back onto the parallel bars when his arms shook. 40 years of boxing through nosebleeds. 40 years of riding out at dawn in the Dakota winter. He had built a body that could take a bullet and keep working for 90 more minutes because he had spent half his lifetime making sure his body obeyed his will. Well, Roosevelt took a bullet to the chest and kept the speech going for 90 minutes. Most of us, meanwhile, cancel a coffee date if we have a head cold. I'm not pointing any fingers. I'm just observing the gulf. Roosevelt built the body. But Viktor Frankl, earlier tonight, reminded us that meaning outlasts the body. Our next thinker was a Japanese psychiatrist working in a leprosy sanatorium. And the patients she met taught her the simplest, most practical definition of meaning you will ever hear. Her name is Mieko Kamiya, born in 1914 into one of the great privileged families of Japan. Her father, Tamon Maeda, was a diplomat and later served in the imperial cabinet. She grew up bilingual, trilingual, quadrilingual, eventually fluent in 5 languages: Japanese, English, German, French, Italian. She studied classics at Tsuda College. She read Dante in the original. She read Aeschylus in Greek. She was, by any measure, one of the best educated women in 1930s Japan. But see, the education and the privilege did not protect her from something. Because Mieko Kamiya, as a young woman, carried inside her a quiet, persistent question that she could not set down. The question was simply, what is it that makes a life worth living? Not philosophically, not in the abstract. She wanted a practical answer. The kind of answer you could apply at 7 o'clock on a grey Tuesday morning when you do not feel like getting up. She went to medical school. She became a psychiatrist. And in 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, she was given an unusual assignment. She was asked to visit a place called Nagashima Iseien. Now, to understand where she was going, you have to understand what Japan did to its leprosy patients. In 1907, Japan had passed a national leprosy prevention law. Under that law, any person diagnosed with Hansen's disease, what the English call leprosy, could be forcibly taken from their family, from their home, from their profession, and placed on a remote island or in a mountain sanatorium for the rest of their life. The law was brutal. It was grounded in a bad science that said the disease was far more contagious than it actually is. It was driven by fear, by stigma, by the ancient horror of skin that changes. Families of diagnosed patients were often forced to change their names. Children were taken from schools. Marriages were dissolved. The patients became, legally and socially, non-persons. And that law remained on the books in Japan. Until 1996, within many of our lifetimes. Nagashima Iseien was one of these isolation colonies. It sat on an island in Okayama Prefecture, in the Seto Inland Sea. It had been founded in 1930. By the time Kamiya arrived in 1943, it housed over 1,000 men, women and children who had been, in effect, erased from Japanese society. Now, the young Kamiya expected to find a place of despair. She expected to see ruined bodies, broken minds, a community of people bitter at the injustice of their imprisonment. She had prepared herself, as a psychiatrist, for the clinical interview of the damned. What she found instead broke her expectations and slowly, over the following decades, rebuilt her entire life's work. Well, she walked through the wooden gates of Nagashima Iseien on a humid summer day. And she began to interview the residents. The first man she met was tending a rose garden. He had been at the colony for 20 years. His fingers were deformed by the disease. He had lost sensation in both hands and could no longer feel the thorns. But he had learned, very carefully, to prune his roses by sight alone. He grew over 40 varieties: the Japanese tea rose, the English damask, a small white rose he had cultivated himself and named after his late wife, who had been buried just outside the colony walls because the authorities would not release her body to her family. Kamiya asked him gently what he was doing. He looked up, smiled. He said, "I am tending my roses." She asked him, and I want you to hear the careful way she phrased this, she asked him, "What makes your life worth living?" He did not understand the question at first. He looked at the roses. He looked back at her. And then he said, "The roses. Every morning I wake up and I think today I must check on the emperor's yellow. It has been slow this spring. And today I must prune the damask. I have 20 things to do for the roses before noon. That is my life, Doctor." Camilla wrote it down in her notebook. She moved on. The next patient was a man teaching 3 new arrivals how to read. They had been farmers. They had never been to school. He had been a schoolteacher before his diagnosis. And now, stripped of his classroom, stripped of his wife, stripped of his children, he had rebuilt a school inside the colony. Every week, he took new students. He taught them hiragana, katakana, basic kanji. He read them Japanese poetry. Camilla asked him what made his life worth living. He said, "These 3 men did not know how to read last month. By next month, they will read the newspaper. That is what makes it worth getting up." The next patient was a woman who wrote haiku. She had no family. She could no longer hold a pen properly, so she dictated her poems to a younger patient who wrote them down. She was publishing in a small colony newspaper that circulated inside Nagashima only. 3 haiku every week. She had been doing it for 15 years. She had written over 2,000 poems that no one outside the colony would ever read. Camilla asked her what made her life worth living. She said the next poem. Camilla walked out of Nagashima Isean that evening and stood on the ferry deck looking back at the island. She had gone in expecting to diagnose despair. She had come out having met some of the most meaningfully engaged human beings she had ever encountered. People who, by every external measure, had the worst lives imaginable. And yet, she went back. Again and again. She interviewed, she listened, she took notes. In 1957, she returned as a full-time staff psychiatrist and worked at Nagashima for 15 years until 1972, and in 1966 she published the book that consolidated everything she had learned from those patients, a book titled Ikigai Nitsuite, which translates roughly as On the Meaning of Life, though it is better rendered as On Ikigai. Now, I want to be very careful here, because it would be easy to romanticize what Camilla saw at Nagashima. These were real people, subjected to a real injustice. They should never have been on that island. The law that put them there was wrong. The stigma was wrong. The separation of families was wrong. That is not up for debate. But inside that wrongness, those patients had done something extraordinary. They had, without benefit of any Western positive psychology book, refused to let the injustice steal the one thing that was still theirs. A small daily reason to get up in the morning. And that refusal. That is the thing Miyoko Camilla went to study, and the thing she eventually taught the world. Now, the word she used, ikigai, was not a word she invented. It had been used in Japanese for centuries. But it was particularly alive and particularly common in the language of Okinawa, the southernmost string of Japanese islands, where a strange demographic fact had been noted for generations. The Okinawans, generally poor, living on small islands with limited resources, living largely on sweet potatoes and vegetables and a little fish, consistently lived longer than almost anyone else on Earth. More centenarians per capita than any other region of the world. And if you asked an Okinawan elder, and a great deal of Blue Zones research by a researcher named Dan Buettner later on asked exactly this question, if you asked them why they thought they lived so long, the answer was almost never medical. It was almost always the same 3 syllables, ikigai. So what is ikigai? Well, let us break it down. It is a compound of 2 Japanese roots. Iki, meaning life. Gai, meaning worth or reason. Ikigai, the worth of life, the reason for life, or more practically, a reason to get up in the morning. Notice what it is not. It is not a mission statement. It is not a life's calling. It is not a grand synthesis of your talents and the world's needs. It is small. It is daily. It is local. And it can change from season to season, from year to year, from decade to decade, depending on what your body can do and what the world around you needs. Kamiya's patients at Nagashima had ikigai in roses, in students, in haiku. The Okinawan grandmothers Buettner later interviewed had ikigai in great-grandchildren, in a vegetable garden, in a weekly moai meeting with their oldest friends. A retired fisherman might have ikigai in teaching his grandson to mend nets. A widow might have ikigai in the cat she feeds twice a day. You see the shape of it? It is not something you discover in a retreat. It is not something you unlock through meditation. It is the small task that makes tomorrow worth starting. And then the day after tomorrow worth starting. And then the next one. And before you know it, you have strung together 50 years of them. Kamiya's insight, and this is why her 1966 book still matters, was that ikigai can survive conditions that should have destroyed a person. It survived Nagashima. It survived the isolation law. It survived the disease. And if it could survive those, then it could certainly survive an ordinary modern life. What modern people often suffer from is not a shortage of capacity for ikigai. It is an overdose of alternative distractions. We look for something bigger, and in doing so we fail to see the rose that is already in front of us. Now, I need to warn you about something, because if you have encountered the word ikigai in any Western self-help context in the last 10 years, there is a very strong chance you have encountered it wrong. You have probably seen a diagram. 4 overlapping circles, like a Venn diagram. The circles are labeled what you love, what you are good at, what the world needs, what you can be paid for. And in the middle of all 4 circles, where they intersect, in the smallest possible sliver of overlap, there is your ikigai. And the implication, the whole argument of the diagram, is that ikigai is a rare and precious thing. It is the thing that is loved by you, fitted to you, needed by the world, and financially viable. If you cannot find that sliver, you do not have ikigai. You have to keep searching. Well, here is something the diagram does not tell you. That 4-circle diagram is not Japanese. It was not created by Mieko Kamiya. It was not used by the Okinawan centenarians. It has nothing to do with ikigai. as the concept was lived in Japan. It was created in 2011 by a Spanish business consultant named Andres Zuzunaga for a presentation on, I believe, purpose and career design. And it was a fine diagram. It was a useful diagram for career counseling. But it was a diagram about purpose, not about ikigai. Somewhere in the years that followed, somebody on the internet took that Zuzunaga diagram, relabeled it as the Ikigai Venn diagram, and claimed it came from Japanese tradition. It did not. It absolutely did not. But the internet does what the internet does, and the misattribution spread. It spread into books. It spread into TEDx talks. It spread into corporate wellness programs. And now millions of Westerners believe that Ikigai is some impossible cosmic sliver at the center of 4 impossible demands. The Western Ikigai diagram has 4 circles. The real Okinawan version has 0. They just had the rose garden. The real Ikigai is much, much simpler and much, much more achievable. You do not need to find the intersection of your passion, your skill, your calling, and your salary. You need to find one small thing that makes tomorrow morning worth waking up for. That is all. A rose in the garden, a student to teach, a poem to finish, a grandchild to call, a cat to feed, a book to read at 9 p.m. It can change tomorrow. You are allowed to have a different Ikigai next week than you have this week. The Okinawan grandmother, whose Ikigai is her great-grandson today, may, 20 years from now, have an Ikigai that is simply the morning sun on her porch. Both are perfectly valid. Both kept her alive past 100. The whole Western machinery of purpose has, in a sense, made Ikigai impossibly hard. Because it has turned a daily reason into a life mission. And most people do not have a life mission. Most people, if they are honest, have a morning, and a kettle, and a task. And if the task is small enough to be doable, and meaningful enough to matter, the day begins. That is what the patients of Nagashima Isseian taught Mieko Kamiya. That is what the grandmothers of Okinawa taught Dan Buettner. And that is what I am trying, very quietly, to pass to you tonight. 10 people, 10 cultures, 10 different centuries, all of them saying, in their own words, the same thing. The answer to your modern problem is not another modern fix. The answer has been here the whole time. You are part of a very long conversation. You are not the first. You are not alone. And the path has been walked before, many times, often in shoes older than any country. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to listen to the extended bonus version, where we cover another 5 stories, join our Patreon, link in the description. YouTube and Spotify have been making it increasingly difficult for small creators on their platforms. I explained the challenges I have been going through at the beginning of this episode. In short, they are paying less or demonetizing channels. To keep myself safe, so I can keep making videos for you, no matter what happens, I've started a Patreon. I will put extended versions on Patreon, 4 hours to 8 hours. The topics go a little deeper, and I'll explore some less sanitized content than on YouTube and Spotify. You can vote on what stories come next there, and I'll also read classics like Poe, Lovecraft, Brothers Grimm, which supporters can choose only on Patreon. every dollar funds more editing time for my editor to make the videos here better and longer. If that sounds like something you would want to support, the door is open. The Patreon link is below. So hear this, nightlings, as you drift towards sleep. You are not a person with problems that nobody understands. You are a person in a lineage of people who have always faced these problems and who have always, eventually, found their way through. The only new thing is you. The wisdom is already here. The bowl has been breaking and being repaired, with gold along the fractures for as long as there have been bowls. And the hands that repaired the bowls before you, they are your hands too. You are part of that lineage, whether you knew it or not. And tonight, you were given the map. What you do with it is your own to decide. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos. Sleep now, nightlings. And wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. The story is done, but yours continues.